The auction hammer fell with the finality of a coffin nail. Sold for $140 to Governor Wallace Morgan. The crowd murmured, some with approval, others with uncomfortable shifting. Everyone knew the Reed homestead was worth 20 times that amount. But no one dared speak against Morgan, not when his men lined the edges of the courthouse steps, hands resting casually on holstered revolvers. Elizabeth Reed stood motionless in the cold drizzle, her spine ramrod straight, despite the weight of the world bearing down upon her shoulders. She was 35, though the last month had carved new lines around her eyes. Her chestnut hair was pulled tight in a practical bun, and her black morning dress, already fading at the hem, was soaked through. She kept one arm wrapped protectively around her 7-year-old daughter, Sarah, whose small face was buried against her mother's side. Wallace Morgan descended the courthouse steps with the casual confidence of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. He was 50 tall and imposing, with a neatly trimmed silver beard and the bearing of a man who'd commanded soldiers. His tailored suit and polished boots stood in stark contrast to the dust and grime of the Montana Territory outpost. "Mrs. Reed," he said, tipping his hat with a practiced smile that never reached his cold blue eyes. "A regrettable business, truly. Your husband's debts were substantial." Beth's jaw tightened. "My husband had no debts until you foreclosed on half the county governor." Morgan's smile didn't falter, but his eyes hardened. "The railroad brings progress, Mrs. Reed. Progress requires sacrifice." He lowered his voice, leaning closer. "I could arrange suitable accommodations for you and the child. A woman alone faces difficulties in these territories. I'm always willing to extend my protection to those who show proper gratitude." The implication hung in the air between them. Beth felt Sarah's small fingers dig into her skirt. "I'd sooner sleep in a rattlesnake pit," Beth said, her Kentucky accent thickening with each word. "My husband knew what you were. That's why you had him killed." Morgan's smile vanished. "Careful, Mrs. Reed. Slander is a serious accusation." He glanced at the star-wearing man beside him. "Sheriff Collins might take interest in such talk, or in those missing documents from my office." Sheriff Collins stepped forward, thumbs hooked in his belt. "Ma'am, there's still the matter of those stolen papers to discuss. The governor's been mighty patient." "My husband was shot in the back after visiting your office, Governor," Beth cut in, voice carrying across the now silent crowd. "Curious timing, wouldn't you say?" Morgan's face darkened. He nodded to Collins, who stepped closer. "I'm afraid I need to take you in for questioning, Mrs. Reed. The child can stay with Reverend Porter until—" "You'll not take my daughter," Beth said, voice like steel. Her hand slipped beneath her shawl where Matthew's army colt rested in a hidden pocket. Morgan raised a hand, stopping Collins. "No need for unpleasantness today." His voice was controlled, but his eyes promised retribution. "You have until sundown tomorrow to vacate the property. After that, you'll be trespassing on my land." He turned away, then paused. "Oh, and Mrs. Reed, do consider my offer. It won't remain open indefinitely." Beth watched him stride to his waiting carriage surrounded by hired guns. Only when he disappeared from view did she allow her shoulders to sag slightly. "Mama," Sarah's voice was small, afraid. "Where will we go?" Beth knelt down, looking into her daughter's eyes, Matthew's eyes, the same warm brown that had captivated her at that field hospital in Gettysburg. "We're going to be fine, little bird," she whispered, brushing a strand of golden hair from Sarah's face. "Your papa taught me how to be strong, remember?" Sarah nodded solemnly. Beth had never sheltered her daughter from hard truths. Matthew had insisted on it. The frontier forgives many things, he'd said, but not ignorance. "Good girl. Now we need to go home and pack only what matters." Beth stood, taking Sarah's hand. "We're leaving tonight." The full moon cast cold light across the small bedroom as Beth carefully placed items into a canvas sack: Matthew's service revolver, an ammunition, his journal, a small photograph in a silver frame, and a sealed packet of documents, the real reason Matthew Reed had been murdered. From beneath a loose floorboard, she retrieved a small pouch of gold coins and a leather folder containing land deeds and military papers. Finally, she added a worn medical kit, a remnant of her days as an army nurse. In the kitchen, she packed jerky hardtack dried apples and a small sack of coffee. A good knife flint, 2 canteens, and Matthew's old army compass completed their essentials. Sarah watched silently, clutching her rag doll and a wooden horse Matthew had carved for her last Christmas. Only what you can carry, little bird, Beth reminded gently. Sarah nodded, placing the doll in her small pack, but hesitating over the horse. Papa made it, she whispered. Beth felt her throat tighten. Then it comes with us. A sound outside froze them, both horses approaching. Beth moved swiftly to the window, peering through the curtain. 4 riders' lanterns bobbing in the darkness. Sheriff Collins, she whispered. They're not waiting until tomorrow. Beth moved with practiced efficiency, securing their packs and helping Sarah into her coat. Remember what your father taught you about the woods? She asked, keeping her voice steady. Sarah nodded, eyes wide but dry. Move quiet, leave no trail, head uphill if followed. That's right. Beth checked the Colt's cylinder. 6 rounds plus the box in her pack. We're going out the back through the creek like when you play trappers, then up toward Settler's Ridge. But that's not the way to town. No, Beth said, extinguishing the lamp. We're not going to town. We're going somewhere new. They slipped out the back door as voices called from the front of the house. Beth led Sarah to the small creek that ran behind their property, their boots leaving no prints as they waded through the shallow water. They had reached the tree line when a shout went up from the house. Lantern lights spilled from the open door as men discovered their absence. Find her, Colin's voice carried through the night. Morgan wants those papers. Beth pulled Sarah deeper into the forest where the darkness swallowed them whole. For 3 days they traveled north, keeping to game trails and avoiding settlements. Beth's knowledge of the land, learned from her father, a Kentucky hunting guide, and refined by Matthew during their years on the homestead, served them well. They crossed 2 county lines, sleeping in sheltered hollows by day and moving by night. On the 4th day, the weather turned. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, bringing bitter cold and the first snow of the season. Beth knew they needed proper shelter. Soon their supplies were dwindling, and Sarah's cough had worsened overnight. Just a little further, she urged, helping Sarah climb a steep embankment. There's a trapper's cabin near here where we can rest. The cabin, when they found it, was nothing but charred remains burned out months before. Beth's heart sank as she surveyed the blackened timbers. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the nearest town was 2 days' hard ride, impossible on foot with a child. What now, Mama? Sarah asked, her small voice muffled by the woolen scarf wrapped around her face. Before Beth could answer, hoofbeats sounded in the distance. She pulled Sarah behind the remains of the cabin wall, one hand on her revolver. 3 riders appeared through the swirling snow, moving slowly, searching. Beth recognized Collins immediately, along with 2 of Morgan's men. They had tracked them despite her precautions. They're here somewhere, one man called. Tracks lead this way. Beth's mind raced. The open country ahead offered no cover for miles. Behind them lay thick forest, but their tracks in the fresh snow would be impossible to hide. Stay here, she whispered to Sarah. No matter what happens, don't move until I come back, or until they're gone. Sarah's eyes widened in fear, but she nodded, tucking herself into a hollow between fallen timbers. Beth slipped away, circling wide through the trees until she was behind the riders. Drawing the Colt, she aimed carefully at a dead branch hanging over the men. The shot cracked through the cold air, sending the branch crashing down and spooking the horses. As the men struggled to control their mounts, Beth fired twice more into the air from different positions, creating the illusion of multiple attackers. Ambush! Collins shouted. Fall back! The men retreated, but not before one fired wildly in Beth's direction. She felt a searing pain as the bullet grazed her arm. Gritting her teeth, she held her position until the riders disappeared into the snow. When she returned to Sarah, the girl was exactly where she'd left her, trembling with cold and fear. We need to move, Beth said, examining her wound quickly. The bullet had torn her coat and left a shallow furrow along her upper arm. Painful but not dangerous. They'll be back with more men. You're hurt, Sarah whispered. It's just a scratch. Beth tore a strip from her petticoat, binding the wound. Can you be brave a little longer? Sarah nodded, her face pale but determined. That's my girl. They set out again, heading northwest into increasingly unfamiliar territory. The snow fell heavier now, and the wind howled across the open plains, driving icy needles into their exposed skin. Beth had lost blood and fatigue dragged at her limbs, but she pushed on, half carrying Sarah when the drifts grew too deep. By nightfall, the temperature had plummeted. Sarah's cough had worsened to wheezing gasps, and her small body burned with fever. Beth's own strength was failing her wounded arms stiff and painful. "We need to stop," she finally admitted, scanning the barren landscape. In the distance, barely visible through the blowing snow, she spotted a faint light, a window perhaps, or a lantern. "Just a little further, baby," she whispered, gathering Sarah in her arms. "I see a light." The journey across that final stretch of open ground was the longest of Beth's life. Each step sank deep into drifting snow, and Sarah's weight slight as it was strained muscles already pushed beyond endurance. Twice she fell struggling back to her feet through sheer determination. The light grew closer, a window set in a two-story structure. Not just a cabin, but a proper house built of dark timber with a stone foundation. As they approached, Beth made out a large barn corrals and a high fence topped with metal spikes. The entire property was positioned on a ridge, offering a commanding view of the surrounding valley. This was no ordinary homestead. It was built for defense. Beth staggered to the gate, Sarah limp in her arms. The girl's breathing had grown shallow, her fever raging. "Please," she whispered, though there was no one to hear. "Please." She pushed through the gate, her boots scraping on ice as she climbed the short steps to the porch. A horseshoe hung above the door, and beside it, a Winchester rifle leaned against the wall. Beth raised her hand and knocked 3 times. Silence. She knocked again, harder, desperation lending strength to her arm. Footsteps approached from within, measured, deliberate steps. A bolt slid back and the door opened a crack. Beth found herself staring down the barrel of a Colt Peacemaker. Behind it, a single blue eye regarded her with cold suspicion. "Please," Beth said, her voice cracking. "My daughter is sick. We need shelter." "You're not welcome here," came a deep, graveled voice. "There's a town 20 miles east." "She won't survive 20 miles, Beth said, pulling back Sarah's scarf to reveal her flushed face. "I'm not asking for charity. I can work. I have money." The eye narrowed, shifting from Beth to Sarah and back again. The gun didn't waver. "You're running from something," the man said. It wasn't a question. Beth straightened, meeting his gaze. "Yes." A moment passed, measured in heartbeats and falling snow. "What's your name?" the man asked. "Elizabeth Reed. This is my daughter, Sarah." Another long silence. Then unexpectedly, the gun lowered. "Reed." The door opened wider, revealing a tall man with broad shoulders and the hard, weathered face of someone who'd spent years under open skies. His dark hair was streaked with gray at the temples, and a long scar ran down his left cheek. He wore a flannel shirt and canvas pants tucked into worn cavalry boots. "Matthew Reed's widow?" he asked, his expression unreadable. Beth's breath caught. "You knew my husband." The man's jaw tightened. He looked at Sarah again, then at the darkening horizon. "Get inside," he said, finally stepping back. "But know this, I'm not a doctor, not a friend, and not a savior. One night, then you go." Beth didn't hesitate. She carried Sarah across the threshold into the warmth beyond. The man closed the door behind them, sliding the heavy bolt back into place. He moved past Beth without another word, disappearing down a hallway. The interior of the house was sparse but well-maintained. A large fireplace dominated the main room, its flames casting dancing shadows across polished floorboards. A worn leather chair sat beside it, with a small table holding a book and half-empty whiskey glass. No photographs adorned the walls. No decorative touches softened the space. Beth lowered Sarah onto a sofa near the fire, removing her wet coat and boots. The girl stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Mama," she whispered. "We're safe now," Beth said, smoothing Sarah's damp hair. "We found shelter." The man returned, carrying a wooden box and a kettle of steaming water. He set them on the table without ceremony. "Medical supplies," he said. "For the girl." Beth opened the box, finding an assortment of herbs, bandages, and medicines, a surprisingly well-stocked kit. She set to work immediately, preparing a willow bark tea for Sarah's fever. The man watched from across the room, arms folded across his chest. "You're wounded," he observed, nodding toward the blood-stained bandage on Beth's arm. "It'll keep," she replied, focused on Sarah. He grunted, then moved to a cabinet, returning with a bottle and clean cloth. Without asking permission, he pulled back her sleeve and removed the makeshift bandage. "Bullet?" he asked, examining the wound. "Graze." He poured whiskey over the gash without warning. Beth hissed but didn't pull away. "Morgan's men?" he asked, voice casual, as he wrapped a clean bandage around her arm. Beth's head snapped up, eyes narrowing. "How did you—" Matthew Reed was the lawyer who filed against Morgan's land seizures. the man said, tying off the bandage with practiced hands. When he was murdered, it made news even out here. He stepped back, returning the bottle to its shelf. I'm Jacob Stone. This is my property, Stone Ridge. Beth nodded slowly. Thank you for the shelter, Mr. Stone. Jacob, he corrected. No need for formalities in the middle of nowhere. He looked at Sarah, who had fallen into a fitful sleep. She needs dry clothes and rest. There's a room at the end of the hall. It's small, but it'll do. Beth hesitated. Why are you helping us? Jacob's expression hardened. I'm not. I'm providing basic human decency for one night. Don't mistake it for anything more. He moved to the door, shrugging into a heavy coat. I need to check the stock. Make yourselves comfortable, but don't go upstairs and don't touch anything you don't need to. With that, he was gone, leaving Beth alone with her sleeping daughter and a host of unanswered questions. Beth woke before dawn, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Sarah slept peacefully beside her, her fever broken sometime during the night. The small room was simple but comfortable, with a narrow bed washstand and single chair. She rose quietly, pulled on her boots, and stepped into the hallway. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of timber settling against the cold. In the main room, the fire had burned low, casting a dull orange glow. Through the window, she could see heavy snow still falling. A noise from the kitchen drew her attention. Jacob stood at the stove, his back to her, pouring coffee into a tin cup. Your daughter's better, he said without turning. Her breathing changed around midnight. Beth wasn't surprised he'd checked on them. This was a man who left nothing to chance. Yes, she said, entering the kitchen. Thank you for the medicines. Jacob turned, offering a cup. Beth accepted it, wrapping her fingers around the warm metal. You said one night, she ventured, watching him over the rim of her cup. Storm hasn't let up, he replied. No sense sending you out to D after bothering to take you in. His tone was matter-of-fact, but Beth caught something else beneath the gruffness, a principle at work. As soon as it clears, then, she said. Jacob nodded, then reached for a folded newspaper on the table. He handed it to her without comment. Beth unfolded it, her breath catching at the headline, Manhunt Continues for Widow of Slain Lawyer. Beneath it, a crude sketch of her face stared back at her. It says I killed a man, she whispered. Did you, Bam? Beth met his eyes. I fired warning shots. If someone died, it wasn't by my hand. Jacob studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. Doesn't matter. Morgan controls the papers from here to Helena. He wants you found, you'll be found. Beth folded the paper carefully. All the more reason for us to leave as soon as possible. I won't bring trouble to your door. Trouble's already here, Jacob said, turning back to the stove. Has been since you knocked. He served a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush and dried venison. They ate in silence until Sarah appeared in the doorway, her color much improved. Mama, she said, eyes darting uncertainly to Jacob. Come eat, little bird, Beth said, pulling out a chair. This is Mr. Stone. He's letting us stay until the storm passes. Sarah approached cautiously, studying Jacob with a child's direct gaze. Do you have children? She asked suddenly. The kitchen went still. Jacob's hand froze halfway to his mouth, then lowered slowly. Sarah, Beth admonished gently. That's not polite. It's fine, Jacob said, his voice flat. No, girl. I don't have children. The lie hung in the air between them. Beth had noticed the small touches around the house that spoke of a child's presence. Once a height mark scratched into a door frame, a drawer in the kitchen that held a child-sized spoon, the way Jacob had known exactly how to check Sarah's fever. Sarah, oblivious to the tension, nodded acceptance and began eating. After breakfast, Jacob disappeared into the storm to tend his livestock. Beth explored the first floor of the house, noting details she'd missed in her exhaustion the night before. The house was well built and methodically organized. Every window had heavy shutters that could be secured from inside. Weapons were strategically placed throughout: a shotgun mounted by the back door, a rifle above the mantel, a revolver in a kitchen drawer. In the pantry, she found enough supplies to last months. This wasn't just a home, it was a fortress. In a small study off the main room, a desk held maps of the territory, some marked with notations. Beth recognized Morgan's properties highlighted in red. A newspaper clipping tacked to the wall detailed the expansion of Morgan's railroad interests. Jacob Stone wasn't just hiding from the world, he was studying his enemy. Beth was examining a bookshelf when Sarah called from the main room. Mama, look what I found. Beth hurried back to find Sarah kneeling by the fireplace, a wooden horse clutched in her hands nearly identical to the one Matthew had carved but older, the paint worn away by years of handling. "Put that back, Sarah," Beth said quickly. "Mr. Stone told us not to touch things." "But it looks like mine," Sarah protested. "Maybe he knows Papa." "Sarah now." The front door opened, bringing a swirl of snow and the imposing figure of Jacob, his coat crusted with ice. His eyes landed immediately on the wooden horse in Sarah's hands. For an instant, something raw and terrible crossed his face, grief so powerful it made Beth step instinctively between him and her daughter. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "She found it by the fireplace. We'll put it back." Jacob closed the door slowly, his eyes never leaving the toy. "It's fine," he said, his voice unnaturally controlled. "It's just a toy." He removed his coat, hanging it by the door with deliberate movements. The silence stretched uncomfortable and heavy. Finally, he spoke again. "That storm's settling in for days. If you're staying, you'll work. I don't keep charity cases." Beth nodded. "Of course. We can help with anything you need." "Good." Jacob moved toward the hallway, then paused. "Keep the horse, girl," he said without turning. "No use gathering dust." He disappeared down the hall, his footsteps fading as he climbed the stairs to the forbidden second floor. Sarah looked up at Beth, confusion clear on her face. "Did I do something wrong?" Beth knelt beside her daughter, taking the wooden horse gently. She turned it over, finding initials carved into the bottom, ES. "No, little bird," she said softly. "You just found something that belongs to memory." 3 days passed in relative peace. The storm continued unabated, transforming the landscape into a white wasteland. Inside, they settled into an uneasy routine. Beth cooked, cleaned, and mended, while Jacob repaired equipment in the barn. Sarah recovered quickly, her natural curiosity soon leading her to explore every accessible corner of the house. Jacob remained distant, but not unkind. He answered Sarah's endless questions with surprising patience, showed her how to whittle simple shapes from pine scraps, and even permitted her to help feed the chickens in the sheltered coop behind the house. With Beth, he maintained a careful formality, speaking only when necessary. Yet she often caught him watching her when he thought she wouldn't notice his expression unreadable. On the fourth night, as they sat before the fire after Sarah had gone to bed, Jacob finally broke his silence. "Why did Morgan kill your husband?" Beth looked up from her mending, startled by the direct question. "Matthew uncovered evidence of Morgan's dealings with government officials, bribes, threats, land theft, particularly regarding Indian territories." Jacob nodded slowly. "The Blackfoot reservations." "Yes, Morgan's been systematically seizing land promised to them by treaty, rerouting his railroad through their hunting grounds." Beth set down her needle. "Matthew was building a case to present to the federal authorities." "And now you have his evidence," Jacob said. It wasn't a question. Beth hesitated, then nodded. "Documents, ledgers, witness statements, enough to destroy Morgan's empire and send him to prison. If you can get them to someone who cares," Jacob added, his tone bitter. "Justice is a rare commodity out here." "There's a federal judge in Denver who worked with Matthew before," Beth said. "If I can reach him," Jacob stared into the fire. "That's a long journey through hostile country, especially with a child." "I don't have a choice," Beth replied simply. Jacob was silent for a long moment. "Then Morgan won't stop hunting you, not ever. Men like him can't afford loose ends." "I know." Beth resumed her mending, the needle flashing in the firelight. "Why do you hate him?" Jacob's head came up sharply. "What makes you think I told your maps, the newspaper clippings, the way you fortified this place?" Beth met his gaze steadily. "You're not just hiding from Morgan. You're hunting him." A muscle worked in Jacob's jaw. He reached for the whiskey bottle beside his chair, poured 2 fingers, and drank it in one swallow. "Morgan took something from me," he said finally, his voice low. "Something I can't get back." Before Beth could respond, a sound outside caught their attention, the distant but unmistakable report of a rifle. Jacob was on his feet, instantly moving to the window with the fluid grace of a predator. He peered through a narrow gap in the shutters, his body tensing. "Riders," he said, his voice changed, harder, focused. 3, maybe 4 coming up from the south ridge. Beth set aside her mending, rising to join him. Through the gap, she could make out distant figures moving through the snow lantern light, bobbing in the darkness. "Morgan's men?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Jacob nodded grimly. "They found you." He moved to the gun cabinet, unlocking it with quick practice movements. Get Sarah. There's a cellar beneath the kitchen. Trapdoor under the rug. Beth hurried to wake her daughter while Jacob loaded weapons, a Winchester rifle, two revolvers, a shotgun placed by the door. When she returned with a sleepy, frightened Sarah, Jacob was checking the windows, his movements precise and controlled. Down there, he said, indicating the open trapdoor. Stay quiet no matter what you hear. Beth hesitated. You can't fight them alone. Jacob's eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw something beyond the carefully maintained wall, a fierce determination that bordered on hunger. I've been waiting for this, he said simply. Beth handed Sarah the lantern. Go down, little bird. I'll be right there. When Sarah had descended, Beth turned back to Jacob. Give me a gun, she said. I know how to use it. Jacob's eyebrow raised slightly. Do you now? My father was a hunting guide in Kentucky, and I was a nurse at Gettysburg. Beth's chin lifted. I've seen more death than most men, and I won't hide while you fight my battles. Jacob studied her for a long moment, then reached for a Remington revolver. He checked the cylinder before handing it to her butt first. 5 shots, he said. Make them count. As Beth took the weapon, their fingers brushed. For an instant, something passed between them, recognition perhaps of a shared quality. They were both survivors shaped by loss into something harder than they'd once been. Get down there with your daughter, Jacob said, his voice gruff. I'll call if I need you. Beth nodded, turning toward the trap door. She had taken only 2 steps when a voice called from outside, unnaturally loud in the snowy stillness. Jacob Stone, I know you're in there, and I know who you're harboring. Jacob's face hardened to granite. He moved to the window, rifle ready. That's Sheriff Collins from Bitter Creek, Beth whispered. Morgan's man. Jacob nodded once. Get below, he said again, his voice leaving no room for argument. Beth descended the ladder into the cellar, pulling the trapdoor closed above her. In the lantern light, Sarah's face was pale and frightened. Are the bad men here? She whispered. Beth pulled her close. Yes, but Mr. Stone will protect us. Above Collins's voice came again. Stone, send out the Reed woman and her brat, and maybe you walk away from this. Governor Morgan's offering a reward, $500. Beth held her breath, waiting for Jacob's response. When it came, his voice was deadly calm, carrying easily through the cold air. I've got a counteroffer, Collins. Turn around and ride out, and I won't put a bullet in each of you. Laughter floated down from above. Big talk from a man who couldn't even protect his own family. Beth felt her blood run cold. Beside her, Sarah clutched her hand tighter. Jacob's voice, when it came again, had changed lower, almost a growl. You've got 30 seconds to clear my property. Or what? You'll shoot the law, add that to your crimes. Collins's voice hardened. We know you're harboring fugitives. Stone, the woman's wanted for murder. 20 seconds. Don't be a fool. Morgan won't stop with just you. He'll burn this place to the ground, just like... The crack of Jacob's rifle split the night. A scream followed, then shouting and confusion. My leg. He shot me. A voice wailed. That was a warning, Jacob called. Next one goes through your head, Collins. Now get off my land. For a moment, only the howl of the wind filled the silence. Then came the sounds of retreating hoofbeats, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. Beth released the breath she'd been holding. Sarah trembled against her side. Are they gone? The girl whispered. For now, Beth answered truthfully. Above them, the trapdoor opened. Jacob's face appeared harsh in the lantern light. They're pulling back, he said, but they'll be back, with more men. Beth helped Sarah up the ladder, then followed. The kitchen felt suddenly colder, though the stove still radiated heat. How did they find us? She asked, keeping her voice low so Sarah wouldn't hear. Jacob's expression was grim. Doesn't matter. What matters is they know you're here now. He looked at Sarah, then back to Beth. You can't stay. The storm is breaking, Jacob interrupted. First light, you need to be gone. Beth nodded slowly. Thank you for what you did. Jacob turned away, checking his rifle. I didn't do it for you. Then why? Beth pressed. Jacob paused, his back still to her. When he spoke, his voice had changed, again, quieter, weighted with something she couldn't name. Because Morgan took everything from me, he said. My wife, my son, my life. He turned, and Beth was struck by the raw hatred in his eyes. I've been waiting 5 years for a chance to hurt him back. Understanding Dawn. That's why you're out here. You're not hiding. You're hunting him. One piece at a time, Jacob confirmed. His men, his operations, anything I can hit and disappear before he knows I was there. A one-man war, Beth said softly. Call it what you want. Jacob ejected the spent cartridge from his rifle, replacing it with mechanical precision. But now you're part of it, and that means you need to be ready. He laid the rifle on the table and looked at Beth directly, his blue eyes intense. Because those men aren't just coming for you anymore, he said. They're coming for all of us. Outside, the wind howled across the ridge, driving snow against the windows like 1,000 tiny fists demanding entry. But within Stone Ridge, something had changed, an alliance forged in the face of a common enemy, fragile but real. Beth met Jacob's gaze steadily, the Remington still firm in her hand. Then we'll be ready, she said. The gray light of dawn revealed a transformed landscape. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a pristine white world that glittered beneath a cold, clear sky. From the kitchen window, Beth watched Jacob moving through knee-deep snow toward the barn, a Winchester rifle slung across his back. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air as he checked the perimeter of the property, alert for any sign of intrusion. After Collins and his men had retreated the previous night, Jacob had remained vigilant, patrolling the house every hour. Beth had stayed awake as well, the Remington close at hand, listening for hoofbeats in the darkness. Only Sarah had slept exhaustion, overcoming fear. Now as Beth prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal and dried apples, she mentally inventoried their meager possessions. The evidence against Morgan remained secure in her pack, along with what little money they had left. They could travel light, but the bitter cold and deep snow would make progress slow, dangerously slow, with a child. Sarah sat at the table quietly playing with the wooden horse Jacob had given her. She had named it Thunder, whispering stories to it when she thought no one was listening. When are we leaving? She asked suddenly, looking up at Beth with eyes too knowing for her 7 years. Beth hesitated. Soon. Mr. Stone says we should go when the sun is higher. But the bad men will find us, Sarah said, her voice matter-of-fact rather than frightened. We'll be careful, Beth assured her, setting a bowl of cornmeal before her. Eat now, we need our strength. The back door opened, bringing a gust of cold air and Jacob's imposing figure. He stamped snow from his boots and hung his coat by the door, his movements efficient and controlled. His eyes took in the scene before him, the packed bags by the door, the breakfast laid out, Sarah with her wooden horse. Storm's past, he said, accepting the coffee Beth offered. But the snow's deep, you won't make good time. We don't have a choice, Beth replied. Jacob drank his coffee in silence, his expression thoughtful. Finally, he set down the cup. I've been thinking, he said slowly, as if the words were unfamiliar territory. There's another option. Beth raised an eyebrow. Stay, Jacob said simply. Work for your keep until spring. Beth stared at him, searching for the trap. Why would you take that risk? Don't mistake it for kindness, Jacob replied, his tone hardening. Morgan's men will be watching of the trails. They'll catch you within a day. And they won't look here again. Oh, they will, Jacob agreed, his mouth curving in what might have been a smile on another man. But here at least you have walls, weapons, and high ground. Beth considered his words. He wasn't wrong. The odds of escaping with Sarah through deep snow while being hunted were slim at best. But staying meant involving Jacob further in their troubles he clearly had enough of already. What would you expect in return? She asked carefully. Work, he said. The place needs tending. Fences need mending come the thaw. Livestock needs care. You cook, clean, help with repairs. And Sarah, Jacob's eyes flicked to the girl who was watching their exchange with undisguised interest. Children should learn useful things, he said. How to recognize animal tracks. How to use a knife safely. How to keep quiet when needed. Beth caught the implications, survival skills, the kind that had kept Jacob alive for 5 years as he waged his solitary war against Morgan. And in return, you shelter us, Jacob nodded once. Until spring, then you go your way, I go mine. Why? Beth pressed. Yesterday, you couldn't wait to be rid of us. Something shifted in Jacob's eyes, a calculation, a decision made. Morgan wants you, he said flatly. That makes you useful to me. As bait, Beth realized. As leverage, Jacob corrected. Morgan's never been this close before. Never sent his men directly to my door. He's exposed himself. Beth considered the offer, weighing their options. Run and likely die or stay and become pawns in Jacob's vendetta. Neither choice seemed promising, yet one offered at least temporary safety for Sarah. We stay, she decided, but on one condition. Jacob's eyebrow raised slightly. You teach me everything you know about fighting Morgan, Beth said, her voice firm. I want to understand his operation, his weaknesses. If I'm to be part of your war, I want to be an ally, not just a piece on your board. Jacob studied her for a long moment, reassessing. Finally, he nodded. Fair enough, he said. We start today. The first test came sooner than Beth expected. After breakfast, Jacob led her to the barn, where he handed her an axe. Woodpile needs replenishing, he said, pointing to a stack of logs. Split them, all of them. Beth looked at the massive pile. There was enough work there for 2 days at least. This is your idea of teaching me about Morgan? She asked skeptically. Jacob's expression didn't change. This is my idea of seeing what you're made of. Morgan's men won't give you breaks because you're a woman. Beth gripped the axe handle, feeling its weight. Without another word, she positioned a log on the chopping block and swung. The blade bit deep, splitting the wood cleanly. Jacob watched her work through several logs, his face impassive. When he spoke again, his voice carried a hint of approval. Your form is good. Your husband teach you. Beth shook her head, positioning another log. My father. He believed women should know how to fend for themselves. Smart man. Beth paused, wiping sweat from her brow despite the cold. Did your wife know how to split wood? The question hung in the air between them. For a moment, Beth thought he wouldn't answer, or worse, that she'd crossed a line that would end their fragile alliance. But Jacob surprised her. No, he said quietly. Emma was a school teacher, gentle, good with numbers and letters, not axes. A shadow crossed his face. She never had to be hard. I made sure of that. The admission revealed more than Jacob likely intended. Before Beth could respond, he turned toward the house. I'm checking the north rid, he said. Keep working. I'll send Sarah out with water. Beth watched him go, understanding dawning. Jacob Stone hadn't always been this hard, this remote. He'd been shaped by loss just as she had, but his had festered for 5 years, feeding a single-minded quest for vengeance. She returned to her work, each swing of the axe more determined than the last. She would prove herself useful, yes, but she would not allow Jacob's hatred to become her own. Matthew had stood for justice, not revenge, and she would honor that distinction. By midday, Beth's arms ached, and blisters had formed on her palms, but nearly a third of the logs were split. Sarah had brought water as promised, then remained to stack the split wood against the barn wall. When Jacob returned, he surveyed their progress without comment. Then he disappeared into the barn, emerging moments later with 3 rifles. Time for your next lesson, he said, handing the smallest, a Winchester carbine, to Beth. To her surprise, he offered a child-sized .22 to Sarah. Both of you. Sarah looked to Beth, uncertain. It's time you learned, little bird, Beth said gently. Remember how Papa showed you his gun? Sarah nodded solemnly. Matthew had insisted their daughter understand firearms, not to use them, but to respect their danger. Mr. Stone is going to teach us properly, Beth continued. It's important, especially out here. Jacob led them to a makeshift range behind the barn, where several targets had been set up at varying distances. With methodical patience, he showed them how to load, aim, and fire their weapons. Sarah proved a quick study, her small hands steady as she squeezed the trigger of the .22. Good, Jacob said when she hit the closest target. Again. Beth was already proficient with a revolver, but the rifle required different skills. Jacob corrected her stance with impersonal efficiency, his hands briefly touching her shoulders to adjust her position. Breathe out when you fire, he instructed. See the target, not just the sights. By late afternoon, both Beth and Sarah could consistently hit their targets. Jacob nodded, satisfied. That'll do for today, he said, collecting the weapons. Tomorrow we start on moving targets. As they walked back to the house, Sarah tugged at Jacob's sleeve. Mr. Stone, she said hesitantly, did your boy know how to shoot? Jacob stopped dead, his back stiffening. For a terrible moment, Beth thought he might lash out, but when he turned, his face showed only a deep, controlled grief. Yes, he said quietly, Ethan was a fine shot, better than I was at his age. It was the first time he'd spoken his son's name aloud. The admission hung in the cold air like a prayer. I'm sorry, Sarah whispered, her small face solemn. Mama says my papa is with the angels. Is Ethan with them too? Beth started to intervene, but Jacob knelt down, bringing himself to Sarah's level. His voice when he spoke was gentler than Beth had yet heard it. I believe he is, he said, and I hope they're looking out for each other up there. Sarah considered this, then nodded, apparently satisfied. She reached out and took Jacob's weathered hand in her small one, tugging him toward the house. After a moment's hesitation, Jacob allowed himself to be led, looking slightly bewildered by the child's easy acceptance. Beth followed behind, her heart aching with unexpected tenderness for this broken man who, despite everything, still remembered how to speak to a child. The days fell into a rhythm. Each morning, Jacob assigned Beth tasks around the property, mending fences, caring for livestock, preserving meat, repairing equipment. The work was hard, especially in the bitter cold, but Beth completed each job without complaint. Each afternoon, they practiced shooting, tracking, or survival skills, often with Sarah participating as much as her age allowed. In the evenings after Sarah was asleep, Jacob began fulfilling his promise to teach Beth about Morgan's operations. He spread maps across the kitchen table marking locations of Morgan's properties, mines, and railroad interests throughout the territory. He controls 3 counties outright, Jacob explained, circling areas with a pencil. Judges, sheriffs, mayors, all in his pocket. The railroad is his public face, but it's the mines that bring the real money. And the Indian lands, Beth asked, studying the map. Jacob's face darkened. The treaties set aside these areas for the Blackfoot. He indicated larger sections of territory. Morgan's been systematically pushing them out acre by acre, burning villages, poisoning water sources, paying soldiers to attack hunting parties. That's what Matthew discovered, Beth said. He had testimony from Army officers who refused Morgan's bribes. Jacob looked up sharply. You have those documents? Beth nodded. Along with ledgers showing payments to government officials and maps where Morgan planned his railroad through protected lands. For the first time, Beth saw genuine hope flicker in Jacob's eyes. With that evidence in the right judge, we could destroy him, he said softly. That was Matthew's plan, Beth agreed, before Morgan had him killed. Jacob was silent for a moment, considering. I've been fighting the wrong way, he finally said. Picking off his men, disrupting shipments, it's been like biting at a bear's ankles. While I've been running with the one weapon that could actually bring him down, Beth finished. Their eyes met across the table, a new understanding forming between them. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't even just about revenge. Together, they had the means to bring real justice, not just for themselves, but for all of Morgan's victims. We need to get those documents to Judge Harmon in Denver, Jacob said, his mind clearly racing ahead. But we can't risk moving until the pass clears in spring. And until then, Jacob's expression hardened with resolve. Until then, we prepare, and we gather more evidence. Morgan's operation is vast. The more we have against him, the harder it will be for him to wriggle free. Beth hesitated, then asked the question that had been troubling her. Why didn't you go this route before? Why the solitary war? Jacob's face closed off, the brief moment of openness gone. That's enough for tonight, he said, folding the maps with deliberate movements. Dawn comes early. He left her alone in the kitchen, the question unanswered, but hanging between them like an invisible barrier. A week passed then, too. Morgan's men did not return, though Jacob remained vigilant, setting traps along the property boundaries and maintaining regular patrols. The weather held cold but clear, allowing them to establish a routine that was almost comfortable. Sarah thrived under the structured days, eagerly absorbing everything Jacob taught her about survival and frontier life. She followed him like a shadow when he permitted it, pestering him with endless questions that he answered with surprising patience. To Beth's amazement, the taciturn man seemed to soften in Sarah's presence. He carved small animals for her from pine scraps, showed her how to identify bird calls, and once, when he thought Beth wasn't looking, allowed himself a small smile when Sarah correctly identified deer tracks in the snow. The change in their host was subtle but unmistakable. Though still guarded, Jacob began to speak more freely occasionally, sharing meals at the table rather than taking his plate to his chair by the fire. Once he even recounted a story from his days as a scout during the war, describing the beauty of the Shenandoah Valley in autumn. Beth found herself watching him when he wasn't aware, the way his hands moved with certainty when cleaning a rifle, the rare moments when his guard dropped and his face relaxed into something approaching peace. She caught herself wondering what he had been like before tragedy had reshaped him, before grief and hatred had carved deep lines around his eyes. On the night marking their third week at Stone Ridge, a Chinook wind blew in from the west, bringing unseasonable warmth that began melting the snow. Beth stepped onto the porch after supper, breathing in the damp, earthy scent of approaching thaw. Jacob joined her, offering a cup of coffee. They stood in companionable silence, watching the mist rise from the snow-covered valley below. "Spring's coming early this year," Jacob observed. Beth nodded. "Another month and the passes will clear." "And you'll leave," Jacob said, his tone unreadable. Beth glanced at him. "That was the agreement." Jacob sipped his coffee, his eyes on the distant mountains. "Agreements can change." Before Beth could respond, a movement at the edge of the property caught her attention, a lone figure on horseback approaching slowly through the gathering dusk. Jacob saw it too. In an instant, the brief moment of warmth vanished, replaced by the familiar tension of the hunter. He handed Beth his coffee cup and stepped back into the house, returning moments later with 2 rifles. "Inside," he said tersely. "Get Sarah to the cellar." Beth took the offered Winchester but didn't move. "I can fight." Jacob's eyes flicked to her, reassessing. After a moment, he nodded. "Stay on the porch," he instructed. "If I raise my hand, shoot." He descended the steps and moved toward the gate, his rifle held casually but ready. Beth positioned herself by the porch post, using it as cover, while keeping the approaching rider in her sights. As the figure drew closer, Beth could make out details. A single rider slumped forward in the saddle as if injured. The horse moved with the plodding gait of an exhausted animal. Jacob called out when the rider was 50 yards from the gate. "That's far enough, state your business." The rider reined in, raising a hand slowly. "Jacob?" "Jacob Stone." Jacob's posture changed subtly, still wary but less aggressive. "Who's asking?" "It's Thomas. Marshal Thomas from Fort Benton." Jacob lowered his rifle slightly but didn't relax. "Come forward," slowly. The rider urged his horse forward at a walk. As he passed through the gate, the fading daylight revealed a man in his 50s with a marshal's badge pinned to his coat and a blood-stained bandage wrapped around his left arm. Jacob approached cautiously, rifle still ready. "What happened to you, Thomas?" The marshal swayed in the saddle. "Morgan's men, ambush outside of Helena." His voice was weak, strained with pain. "Been riding 3 days to reach you." Jacob holstered his weapon and moved to help the man from his horse. "Beth," he called, "need you down here?" Beth set aside her rifle and hurried down the steps. Up close, Marshal Thomas looked even worse, his face pale and drawn, his bandaged arm crusted with dried blood. "Get his other side," Jacob instructed. Together they half-carried the wounded man into the house. Sarah, who had been watching anxiously from the window, quickly cleared the sofa at Jacob's direction. They laid Thomas down, and Beth immediately began examining his wound. "Gunshot," she assessed carefully, removing the filthy bandage. "Clean through the muscle, but it's infected. I need hot water, whiskey, and your medical supplies." Jacob nodded, moving to gather what she needed. Sarah hovered nearby, wide-eyed but calm. "Can I help, Mama?" she asked. Beth smiled reassuringly. "Yes, little bird. Bring me clean cloths from the kitchen." As they worked to clean and dress the marshal's wound, the man drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally muttering Jacob's name or fragments about Morgan and coming. Finally, with the wound properly cleaned and bandaged, and a dose of laudanum administered for the pain, Thomas fell into an exhausted sleep. Beth washed the blood from her hands and joined Jacob by the fire, where he stood watching the marshal with a troubled expression. "He'll live," she said quietly, "but that arm needs time to heal properly." Jacob nodded absently, his mind clearly elsewhere. "He rode 3 days with that wound," he murmured. "Must be important." "Who is he?" Beth asked. "You trust him." "Marshal Thomas is one of the few honest lawmen left in the territory," Jacob replied. "We served together during the war. He's been helpful from time to time." The admission surprised Beth. Until now, she'd assumed Jacob operated entirely alone in his campaign against Morgan. "Will he stay once he's recovered?" Jacob shook his head. "Thomas isn't a man who stays anywhere long, but if he rode all this way injured, he has information we need." They didn't have to wait long. As if sensing their discussion, Thomas stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He looked around groggily until his gaze settled on Jacob. "Stone," he croaked. "Thank God." Jacob moved to his side, offering water. Easy, old friend. You're safe now. Thomas drank greedily, then pushed himself up on his good arm despite Beth's protests. His eyes found her narrowing slightly. You must be the Reed woman, he said. Whole territory's looking for you. Beth tensed, but Jacob placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. She's under my protection, he said simply. What happened, Thomas? The marshal leaned back, his face grim. Morgan's on the move, Jacob. Not just his usual men, he's brought in gunmen from as far as Wyoming. Professional killers. Jacob's expression didn't change, but Beth felt his hand tighten slightly on her shoulder. How many, he asked. 20, maybe 30, Thomas replied. And they're not just after Mrs. Reed anymore. They're coming for you too. He paused, his eyes meeting Jacob's. Morgan knows who you are, Jacob. What you've been doing these past years. A chill ran through Beth. Until now, she'd assumed Jacob's isolated homestead was unknown to Morgan, a safe haven precisely because it was off the grid. How? Jacob demanded. Thomas shook his head wearily. Don't know. Someone talked maybe. Or he connected the dots after Collins reported finding the Reed woman here. Jacob's jaw tightened. When term, 2 days, maybe 3, Thomas said. They were gathering in Helena when I left. Morgan himself is leading them. The news hung in the air like a physical presence. Beth felt a coldness settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the winter air. Jacob's face had gone hard as stone, his eyes distant, calculating. Jacob, Thomas continued, his voice grave. They're not just coming to arrest anyone. Morgan wants Stone Ridge wiped off the map. He's making an example of you. Jacob was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was deadly calm. Then we'll be ready for him. Beth looked up at him, searching his face. Jacob, we can't fight 30 armed men. We should run while we have the chance. No! Jacob said, his decision clearly already made. Running is what he expects. We make our stand here. This is madness, Beth protested. Think of Sarah. Jacob's eyes met hers, and what she saw there wasn't the blind hatred she expected, but a cold, clear purpose. Morgan has spent 20 years destroying lives without consequence, he said quietly. He's never faced real resistance. He expects to find a frightened woman and a broken man he can easily eliminate. A grim smile touched his lips. We're going to show him how wrong he is. Thomas coughed weakly. You can't win this fight alone, Jacob. He's not alone, Beth said, surprising herself. Despite her fear, she recognized the truth of Jacob's words. Running would only postpone the inevitable. Morgan would never stop hunting them, not while they possessed the evidence that could destroy him. Jacob's eyes softened fractionally as they met hers. We have 3 guns high ground and the element of surprise, he said. And we have what Morgan wants most, your evidence in my head on a pike. And my rifle, once I can hold it steady, Thomas added, grimacing as he shifted his wounded arm. Jacob nodded to his old friend, then turned to Beth. We have work to do, starting now. As they began planning their defense, a distant howl echoed across the valley, a wolf calling to its pack. The sound sent a shiver down Beth's spine, not of fear but of recognition. They too were now a pack bound together against a common predator. Sarah, who had been quietly watching from the corner, slipped her small hand into Beth's. Are the bad men coming again, Mama? She whispered. Beth knelt, meeting her daughter's eyes. Yes, little bird, but this time we're not running. Sarah nodded solemnly, then turned to Jacob. I can help too, Mr. Stone. You taught me how to be quiet and how to shoot. Jacob looked down at the child, and for an instant Beth caught a glimpse of the man he must have been before, a father protective and kind. He knelt beside Sarah, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. You can help by being brave, he said softly, and by remembering everything I taught you about the secret ways off this mountain. Sarah's small brow furrowed. But you said we're not running. We're not, Jacob confirmed, but the smartest fighters always have a way out if they need it. He glanced at Beth, then back to Sarah. Promise me you'll do exactly what your mother says, no matter what happens. Sarah nodded solemnly. I promise, Mr. Stone. As Sarah went to help Thomas with another cup of water, Jacob pulled Beth aside. If things go wrong, he said quietly, there's a tunnel from the cellar that leads to a cave on the north side of the ridge. Take Sarah and the evidence and go. Don't look back. Beth started to protest, but Jacob silenced her with a look. Morgan wants me more than he wants you, he continued. I can buy you time. I won't leave you to die, Beth said fiercely. Jacob's expression softened almost imperceptibly. I don't plan on dying, Beth, but Sarah needs her mother. Promise me you'll get her out if it comes to that. Beth wanted to argue further, but the truth of his words was undeniable. Sarah must come first always. I promise, she said reluctantly, but it won't come to that. We'll face him together. Outside, the Chinook wind continued to blow, melting the snow that had protected them for weeks. By morning, the paths would be clear enough for riders. Morgan and his men were coming, and Stone Ridge would soon become either a fortress or a tomb. In the fading light, Jacob moved to check the windows, his rifle never far from his hand. Beth watched him, seeing not just the hardened survivor who had reluctantly taken them in, but a man fighting for something beyond mere vengeance, a chance to right wrongs too long ignored. She thought of Matthew, of his belief in justice rather than revenge, and wondered if he would approve of the path she now walked. But as Sarah curled trustingly against her side, Beth knew with certainty that some battles couldn't be avoided, only faced with courage and conviction. We have until dawn to prepare, Jacob said, returning to the fire. Morgan will want daylight for what he has planned. Thomas nodded grimly. He doesn't just want you dead, Jacob. He wants to erase any trace that you ever existed. Same as he did with... The marshal trailed off, but Beth caught the implication. Same as he did with Jacob's family. Jacob's face revealed nothing, but Beth saw his hand tighten on the rifle stock until his knuckles whitened. Then he'll have to work for it. Jacob said, his voice a low promise that sent chills down Beth's spine. Because I've been waiting 5 years for him to find me. Dawn arrived with cruel clarity. The Chinook wind had scoured the sky clean of clouds, leaving a vast blue expanse that promised warmth later, but offered little comfort in the frozen hour before sunrise. The snow had retreated from the pathways and lower slopes, leaving muddy trails easily traversed by horsemen. Beth stood at the upstairs window, a position forbidden to her until now, and surveyed the approaches to Stone Ridge. From this height, she could see for miles across the valley. No riders yet, but the day was young. Behind her, Jacob methodically checked weapons and ammunition, laying them out on a rough-hewn table. The room, sparsely furnished with a narrow bed and wooden chests, contained maps tacked to walls and a spyglass mounted by the window. This was Jacob's war room, the heart of his 5-year campaign against Morgan. They'll come from the south trail, Jacob said, not looking up from his work. It's the only approach wide enough for a large group. We'll have clear sight lines when they reach that ridge. He nodded toward a distant outcropping. Beth turned from the window. How many rifles do we have? 5 that are worth using, 2 shotguns, 4 revolvers. Jacob slid a cartridge into a Winchester repeater, and enough ammunition to make Morgan regret finding us. The confidence in his voice didn't quite reach his eyes. They both knew the odds. 3 adults, 1 wounded against Morgan's small army. No matter how well positioned they were, numbers eventually told. Sarah stays in the cellar, Beth said, not a question. Jacob nodded. With food, water, and a clear path to the tunnel if needed. The mention of the escape route hung between them, an acknowledgement of the possibility of defeat neither wished to dwell on. I've been thinking, Beth said, moving closer to the table. Morgan wants the evidence I have. What if we use that? Jacob glanced up. How? Leave a false trail. Make him think we fled during the night, taking the evidence with us. Split his forces. A glimmer of approval crossed Jacob's face. It could work. We'd need something convincing. A sharp whistle from below interrupted them. Thomas's signal, one long too short. Someone approaching. Jacob moved to the window, spyglass in hand. Beth joined him, her heart suddenly pounding. But instead of the expected column of riders, a single figure on horseback approached from the east, a direction neither had anticipated. The rider moved carefully, leading a second horse laden with what appeared to be bundles. Blackfoot, Jacob said, lowering the spyglass. His expression had changed, wariness giving way to something like recognition. Friend or foe? Beth asked, hand moving instinctively to the revolver at her hip. That depends on who you ask. Jacob set down the spyglass and moved toward the door. Stay here. Keep watch on the south trail. Beth watched from the window as Jacob emerged from the house, rifle in hand, but held casually. The Blackfoot rider stopped at the gate, raising an empty hand in greeting. Even from this distance, Beth could see he was an older man, his long hair streaked with gray, his face deeply lined. To her surprise, Jacob returned the gesture, then opened the gate. The 2 men spoke briefly. Then Jacob led the visitor toward the barn, both horses in tow. Beth returned her attention to the southern approach, but her mind raced with questions. Jacob had never mentioned Blackfoot allies. Indeed, he'd spoken little of his interactions with the tribes whose lands Morgan was systematically stealing. She was still pondering this when the door opened behind her. Jacob entered, followed by the Blackfoot man. Up close, he was older than Beth had first thought, perhaps 60, with keen dark eyes that assessed her thoroughly. "Beth, this is Thunder Eagle," Jacob said. "An old acquaintance." Thunder Eagle's weathered face creased in what might have been amusement. "We share enemies," he said in careful English. "That makes us more than acquaintances, Stone." Jacob's jaw tightened, but he didn't contradict the man. "Thunder Eagle brings news and help." The older man moved to the window, his movements deliberate and dignified despite his age. "Morgan's men crossed Blackfoot hunting grounds yesterday, many riders well armed." He glanced at Jacob. They did not hide their purpose. "How many?" Beth asked. 27. Thunder Eagle replied precisely. 22 white men, 5 half-breeds who know the mountains. They camp now at Eagle Creek, half-day's ride from here. Jacob exchanged a look with Beth. This confirmed Thomas's warning and shortened their timeline considerably. "You've come to warn us," Beth said. "Thank you." Thunder Eagle shook his head slightly. "Not only to warn, to fight." He looked directly at Jacob. "Morgan burns Blackfoot villages, poisons our hunting grounds, kills our children with his soldiers. His enemy is our enemy." Jacob's expression remained carefully neutral. "This isn't your fight, old man." "All fights against Morgan are my fight," Thunder Eagle replied simply. "And I do not come alone." He gestured toward the eastern ridge where Beth now noticed 5 mounted figures waiting silently among the pines. "My sons and nephews," Thunder Eagle explained, "warriors who remember what it means to protect our lands." Jacob seemed to struggle with himself for a moment. Beth could read the conflict in his eyes, reluctance to involve others in his personal vendetta, warring with the practical necessity of additional fighters. "Morgan won't show mercy to anyone who stands with us," he warned. Thunder Eagle's expression hardened. "Morgan showed no mercy to our women and children when he burned our winter camp 2 seasons ago. We do not expect it now." The blunt statement hung in the air. Beth looked from Thunder Eagle to Jacob, understanding dawning. This wasn't just about Jacob's family or her evidence against Morgan. This was about a pattern of violence and theft that had claimed countless victims. "We would be honored to have your help," she said before Jacob could respond. Thunder Eagle nodded to her approval in his eyes. Jacob said nothing, but the slight relaxation of his shoulders signaled acceptance. "I must speak with my men," Thunder Eagle said, moving toward the door. "We will return before midday to prepare." When he had gone, Beth turned to Jacob. "You didn't tell me you had Blackfoot allies." "I don't," Jacob replied, returning to his weapons. "Thunder Eagle and I have an understanding, nothing more." "He seems to think differently." Jacob's hands stilled on the rifle he was cleaning. For a moment, Beth thought he would maintain his silence, but then he sighed. "5 years ago, when Morgan's men burned my home, Thunder Eagle's people found me," he said, voice low and controlled. "I was half dead, badly burned. They took me to their camp, treated my wounds. When I recovered, I learned Morgan had blamed the attack on Blackfoot raiders." "A convenient lie," Beth observed. "More than convenient," Jacob continued. "It gave him an excuse to petition the territorial governor for troops to protect settlers from hostile Indians. Those troops drove the Blackfoot from their winter hunting grounds land that Morgan promptly claimed for his railroad." The pieces connected in Beth's mind. "So your war against Morgan began as a way to clear my name," Jacob confirmed. "It became something more." He fell silent, returning to his work. Beth sensed there was more to the story, much more, but before she could press further, Sarah's voice called from below. "Mama, Mr. Marshall needs you." Beth gave Jacob a look that promised they would continue this conversation, then headed downstairs. In the main room, Thomas had managed to sit up, though his face was pale with the effort. "Sorry to trouble you, ma'am," he said when Beth entered. "Fever's up again." Beth checked his wound, finding it hot to the touch, but not dangerously infected. As she prepared a willow bark tea for the fever, Sarah hovered nearby, watching with solemn attention. "Is Mr. Stone still angry at the Indian man?" she asked suddenly. Beth paused, surprised. "What makes you think Mr. Stone is angry with him, little bird?" Sarah shrugged. His voice got tight like when he's angry but doesn't want to show it, and he wouldn't look at him proper. Beth sometimes forgot how perceptive children could be. It's complicated, Sarah. Sometimes grown-ups can be both grateful to someone and angry with them at the same time. Why? Beth considered how to explain. Well, sometimes helping someone means they have to face things they'd rather forget. It's like when you had that splinter last month and I had to use the needle to get it out. You were mad at me for hurting you, even though I was helping. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. So the Indian man took out Mr. Stone's splinter, and now Mr. Stone has to remember it hurts. Something like that? Beth smiled, ruffling her daughter's hair. You're a very smart girl, you know that. Papa always said so, Sarah replied with simple confidence. Beth felt the familiar pang at the mention of Matthew. What would he think of their current situation? Of the battle to come, Matthew had believed in justice through law, not violence. Yet here they were preparing for a fight that could only end in bloodshed. Her thoughts were interrupted by Jacob's heavy tread on the stairs. He entered the room, his face grim. Riders on the South Ridge, he announced. Just scouts for now, but they've found us. Thomas struggled to rise. How many? 2. They're keeping their distance, watching. They'll report back to Morgan, Thomas said. We have hours at most. Jacob nodded. Thunder Eagle and his men are circling around to the west. They'll provide warning when the main force approaches. He turned to Beth. It's time to get Sarah to the cellar. Beth knelt before her daughter, taking small hands in hers. Remember what we talked about, little bird? You're going to stay in the safe place below while we deal with the bad men. Sarah nodded solemnly. And I'm to stay quiet as a mouse and only come out when you or Mr. Stone calls the special whistle. That's right. Beth hugged her tightly, breathing in the scent of her hair. I love you more than anything in this world, Sarah Reed. Don't you forget it. I love you too, Mama. Sarah's voice was steady, though her small fingers clutched Beth's dress tightly. Jacob approached, kneeling awkwardly beside them. From his pocket, he produced a small, carved wooden fox, its surface smooth from hours of careful work. This is for you, he said, offering it to Sarah. Foxes are clever. They always find a safe path. Sarah accepted the carving with reverent hands. Thank you, Mr. Stone. I'll keep it forever. Something shifted in Jacob's expression. Pain, memory, resolve all mingled together. He reached out hesitantly, then rested his large hand gently on Sarah's head. You're a brave girl, he said quietly. Your papa would be proud. The simple statement brought tears to Beth's eyes. It was perhaps the kindest thing Jacob had said since they'd arrived at Stone Ridge. Sarah looked up at him solemnly. Will you and Mama be all right? Jacob didn't offer false assurances. We'll do our best, he said. That's all anyone can do. Beth led Sarah to the cellar, helping her settle into the small space they'd prepared. Blankets, lantern, water, food, and a chamber pot were arranged neatly in the corner, farthest from the entrance. The tunnel Jacob had mentioned was concealed behind a stack of empty barrels, its entrance just large enough for a child or small adult to navigate. Remember the way to the cave, Beth reminded her. Follow the markers Mr. Stone showed you. Red cloth tied to roots, Sarah recited. Then the big rock shaped like a bear, then down to the hollow tree. Good girl. Beth kissed her forehead. If you hear fighting, stay put. If something happens to the house, use the tunnel. Wait in the cave until dark, then make your way to the Blackfoot camp like Thunder Eagle showed you. But you'll come get me, Sarah said, her confidence wavering slightly. You and Mr. Stone. Beth forced a smile. Of course we will, but brave explorers always know all the trails just in case. She kissed Sarah once more, then reluctantly climbed the ladder. The trapdoor closed with a soft thud that felt terribly final. When Beth returned to the main room, Jacob and Thomas were deep in conversation, heads bent over a rough map of the property. We've got explosives here and here, Jacob was saying, indicating points along the southern approach. Not enough to stop them all, but enough to break their formation. What about the barn? Thomas asked. It gives them cover if they reach it. Jacob's expression was grim. If they reach the barn, we burn it. Better than letting them use it as a position. Beth joined them at the table. Sarah settled. What's our plan? Jacob straightened, giving her an assessing look. You still have time to join her. Take the tunnel. Make for the Blackfoot camp. I'm staying, Beth said firmly. This is my fight and as much as yours. Jacob held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. All right then. Thomas will stay here, cover the approaches from the windows. You and I will take positions upstairs for the initial defense. If they breach the perimeter, we fall back to the house. And if they breach the house? Beth asked. Jacob's jaw tightened. They won't. The certainty in his voice was almost convincing, almost. Beth moved to the window, watching as Thunder Eagle and his warriors took positions among the rocks and trees surrounding the property. The Blackfoot moved like shadows, blending so perfectly with the landscape that even knowing where to look, she could barely discern their presence. How did you really meet Thunder Eagle? She asked without turning. Behind her, Jacob paused in his preparations. The silence stretched so long she thought he might not answer. I was a scout for the 7th Cavalry before the war, he finally said, his voice low. Mapped most of this territory. The Commander Jenkins had us marking potential routes for the railroad, identifying tribal lands that could be repurposed. Beth turned to face him. Jacob wasn't looking at her. His eyes focused on the rifle in his hands. I didn't know what the maps would be used for, he continued. Not at first. By the time I understood, Jenkins had already sent our findings to his financial backers in the East. Morgan, Beth guessed. Jacob nodded. Among others. When I objected, Jenkins had me transferred. After the war, I returned to find Morgan using my maps to systematically seize tribal lands. He'd become territorial governor by then, with an army of hired guns to enforce his claims. That's when you became marshal, Thomas interjected, to fight him legally. For all the good it did, Jacob said bitterly, the law works differently for men like Morgan. Beth understood now. So when Morgan killed your family, it wasn't just murder. It was silencing the one man who could expose his entire operation and tie him to a dozen massacres of native villages, Jacob confirmed. Morgan doesn't just want land. He wants to erase anyone who might challenge his version of history. The revelation cast their coming battle in a new light. This wasn't just about personal vengeance or even justice for Matthew. This was about stopping a man who rewrote history with blood, who built his empire on stolen land and murdered innocents. Your maps and my husband's legal evidence, Beth said slowly. Together they tell the complete story of Morgan's crimes. Enough to hang him 10 times over, Thomas agreed, if we can get them to the right people. A piercing whistle cut through the air, 3 short bursts, Thunder Eagle's signal. They're coming, Jacob said, moving swiftly to the window. Through the spyglass, he surveyed the southern approach. Main force, 20 riders at least, moving fast. The moment they had prepared for it arrived. Beth felt a curious calm settle over her, the same focus she had known in the field hospitals during the war. Fear had no place now. Only action mattered. Jacob handed her a loaded Winchester. Remember your training. Aim for the center. Make each shot count. Beth checked the rifle methodically, just as he had taught her. I won't let you down. A ghost of a smile touched Jacob's lips. I know. They moved upstairs to their positions, Jacob at the front window, overlooking the gate, Beth at the side where riders might attempt to circle around. From her vantage point, she could see the approaching column, dust rising from beneath their horses' hooves. At their head rode a man in a dark coat on a large black horse, Governor Wallace Morgan himself, come to oversee the destruction of his enemies. Morgan's leading them, she called to Jacob. Front and center. Overconfident, Jacob replied. Good. The distance closed rapidly. 500 yards. 400. 300. The riders maintained their formation, clearly visible now against the muddy snow. At 200 yards, Jacob gave a sharp whistle, the signal to Thunder Eagle. Seconds later, a rifle shot cracked from the rocks to the west. One of Morgan's outriders tumbled from his saddle. Confusion rippled through the approaching column. A second shot, then a third, each from different positions. More men fell. The neat formation dissolved as riders sought cover that didn't exist on the open approach. Then Jacob fired his shot, dropping a man near Morgan. Beth followed suit, aiming for a rider attempting to circle toward the eastern side of the property. Her bullet struck true, and the man slumped forward before sliding from his horse. Morgan's voice carried across the distance, shouting orders. The riders regrouped, abandoning their direct approach in favor of a scattered charge designed to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers. They're splitting up, Beth called, coming from all sides. Hold your position, Jacob replied calmly. Wait for clean shots. The battle descended into chaos. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions, As Thunder Eagle's warriors engaged the flanking riders, smoke began to drift across the battlefield, obscuring portions of the approach. Beth fired methodically, each shot deliberate. Two more riders fell to her rifle before the remainder reached the cover of the outbuildings. From the barn and corral, they returned fire bullets thudding into the wooden walls of the house. Below, Thomas had dragged himself to a window, adding his fire to the defense. His aim, despite his wounded arm, remained deadly accurate. For several minutes, the exchange continued, neither side gaining advantage. Then Beth spotted movement at the rear of the barn, men with torches preparing to rush the house. "Fire!" she shouted to Jacob. "They're going to burn us out!" Jacob swore, abandoning his position to join her. He fired rapidly, dropping one torchbearer, but the others had already ignited the dry hay stored against the barn's outer wall. Flames licked upwards, spreading with frightening speed in the wind. "We need to fall back," Jacob said grimly. "This position won't hold once that fire spreads." As if to emphasize his point, a section of the barn roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. The remaining riders used the distraction to charge toward the house, firing as they came. Beth and Jacob retreated downstairs, joining Thomas in the main room. Outside, the fire had spread to the corral and was threatening the west side of the house. Smoke began to seep through cracks in the walls. "The cellar," Jacob said decisively. "We make our stand here by now. If the house burns, the trapdoor is thick enough to protect us until the fire passes." Beth's heart seized. "Gara is safer there than anywhere else," Jacob finished. "The cellar walls are stone. Fire can't touch her." A thunderous crash from outside interrupted them, the barn collapsing completely. Through the window, Beth could see riders closing in on the house, Morgan among them, his face visible, now set in lines of cold determination. "Time to go," Jacob said, helping Thomas toward the kitchen. Beth grabbed the evidence, all of it. Beth retrieved her pack containing Matthew's documents, then Jacob's maps from upstairs. As she returned to the main room, a bullet shattered the window, sending glass spraying across the floor. Outside, a voice called through the smoke. "Stone, send out the woman and the evidence, and I might let you die quick." Morgan's voice, cultured and controlled even in the midst of battle. Jacob's response was a rifle shot through the broken window. A cry of pain suggested he'd found his mark. "Go," he urged Beth. "I'll be right behind you." Beth hesitated. "Jacob." "Go," he insisted, firing again. "Get to Sarah." Beth turned reluctantly, hurrying to the kitchen, where Thomas waited by the open trap door. As she helped him down the ladder, a massive impact shook the house, Morgan's men battering the front door. "Jacob," she called. "I'm coming," he responded, backing into the kitchen, rifle still trained on the hallway. "Close it behind me." Beth descended the ladder, finding Sarah huddled in the corner, eyes wide with fear. The child ran to her, clinging tightly. "It's all right, little bird," Beth soothed, though they both knew it was a lie. "We're all going to stay down here until the bad men leave." Above them, the trapdoor opened, and Jacob descended quickly, pulling the heavy door closed behind him. He wedged a timber against it, securing it as best he could. "They're inside the house," he said quietly. "Won't take them long to find this." The four of them huddled in the cellar's dim lantern light, listening to the sounds of boots overhead. Dust sifted down as Morgan's men searched the house, overturning furniture and smashing what they couldn't move. "If they fire the house, we'll have minutes at most before the air goes bad," Thomas whispered. "We need to use the tunnel." Jacob shook his head. "They'll have men watching every possible exit. The tunnel's our last resort, not our first." Beth held Sarah close, feeling the child tremble against her. "What's our plan?" Before Jacob could answer, a voice called from directly above them. "Check that rug. There might be a cellar." Heavy footsteps crossed the kitchen floor. The rug was pulled aside with a scraping sound. Then silence as the searcher discovered the trapdoor. "Governor found something," the voice called. More footsteps. Then a new voice, Morgan's cultured tones. "Well done, Phillips." "Open it." "It's barred from below, sir." "Then shoot through it," Morgan ordered impatiently. Jacob moved with astonishing speed, pushing Beth and Sarah toward the tunnel entrance. "Go now." Bullets splintered through the trap door, embedding in the dirt floor where they had been sitting moments before. Thomas returned fire, shooting upward through the wooden door. A cry of pain suggested he'd hit one of their attackers. Beth helped Sarah into the tunnel entrance, then turned back. "Jacob, come on." But Jacob had taken position beside Thomas, both men firing up at the trap door, keeping Morgan's men at bay. "Get her out," Jacob shouted. "We'll hold them off." I'm not leaving you, Beth protested. Jacob's eyes met hers, and in that moment she saw everything he couldn't say, regret, resolve, and something deeper that might have grown into tenderness given time. Some battles aren't meant to be won, he said quietly. They're meant to be survived. Take the evidence. Get to Judge Harmon. Finish what your husband started. Beth felt tears sting her eyes. Jacob, please. A massive crash interrupted her as part of the kitchen floor collapsed, bringing two of Morgan's men tumbling into the cellar. Jacob and Thomas fired instantly, dropping both intruders, but the damage was done. Through the new opening, Beth could see flames spreading across the kitchen floor above. The house is burning, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. We all need to go, now. Jacob hesitated, looking at Thomas. The marshal nodded painfully. She's right, Jacob. Live to fight another day. For a moment, Beth thought Jacob would refuse, would choose to make his final stand here beneath the burning house he had built. Then Sarah's small voice called from the tunnel. Mr. Stone, please come with us. Something in the child's plea seemed to reach him. Jacob's expression changed, the hard lines of vengeance, softening into something like resignation. All right, he said finally. Thomas first. They helped the wounded marshal into the tunnel. Then Jacob collected the remaining weapons and ammunition. As Beth prepared to follow, Jacob caught her arm. If we get separated, he said urgently, head northeast to Thunder Eagle's camp. It's 3 days hard travel, but they'll protect you. Beth nodded. We won't get separated. Above them, the house groaned as flames consumed its structure. Smoke began to fill the cellar in earnest. Go, Jacob urged. I'm right behind you. Beth crawled into the narrow passage, pushing forward to catch up with Sarah and Thomas. The tunnel was cramped but passable, its walls shored up with timber and packed earth. Root systems hung from the ceiling, occasionally brushing against her face like ghostly fingers. Behind her, she could hear Jacob following his larger frame, struggling with the confined space. They moved as quickly as possible, the sounds of pursuit fading behind them, replaced by the muffled roar of the fire-consuming Stone Ridge. They had traveled perhaps 30 yards when a tremendous crash echoed through the tunnel. The ground shook and dust and debris showered down upon them. The house, Thomas whispered from ahead. It's coming down. Beth looked back but could see only darkness where Jacob should have been. Jacob, she called, her voice tight with fear. No answer came. Jacob, she called again, louder. Still nothing. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant rumble of collapsing timbers. Beth began to push backward, determined to find him, but Thomas's voice stopped her. Mrs. Reed, don't. The tunnel could collapse. I'm not leaving him, she insisted. Mama, Sarah's frightened voice came from ahead. What's happening? Beth closed her eyes, briefly torn between the man behind and her child ahead. There was no choice, really. There never had been. I'm coming, Sarah, she called, forcing steadiness into her voice. Keep moving. Follow the tunnel. With one last look into the darkness behind, Beth continued forward, every inch, feeling like a betrayal. Jacob had known this might happen, she realized, had positioned himself last deliberately to ensure they would go on without him if necessary. After what seemed an eternity, the tunnel began to slope upward. Faint light appeared ahead, growing stronger as they approached. Finally, they emerged into a small cave, its entrance concealed by brush, but providing a view of the valley below. From this vantage point, Stone Ridge was clearly visible, or what remained of it. The house was entirely engulfed in flames, black smoke billowing skyward. Morgan's men had formed a perimeter around the property, watching the destruction with the patient certainty of men who had done this before. Of Jacob, there was no sign. We need to keep moving, Thomas urged, his face pale with pain and exhaustion. Morgan's men will search the hillside once the fire burns down. Beth nodded numbly, helping the marshal to his feet. Sarah, stay close to me. They made their way carefully down the back side of the ridge, using trees and rocks for cover. The going was slow, especially with Thomas's wound, but by midday they had put considerable distance between themselves and the burning homestead. As they rested in the shelter of a rock outcropping, Sarah approached Beth, her small face solemn. Mr. Stone didn't come out, did he? She asked quietly. Beth pulled her daughter close. I don't know, little bird. He might have found another way. But they both knew the truth. Jacob Stone had made his stand, as he had always intended to do. Whether he had survived was another matter entirely. Thomas watched them with sympathetic eyes. Stone's hard to kill, he offered. I've seen him walk away from worse. Beth appreciated the attempt at comfort, but the marshal's tone betrayed his true thoughts. No one survived a house collapse and fire of that magnitude. Jacob was gone, and with him, their best hope of navigating the wilderness to safety. As they prepared to continue their journey, a sound from the forest made them freeze. The snap of a branch, the rustle of underbrush. Thomas raised his revolver with his good arm, and Beth positioned herself in front of Sarah. A figure emerged from the tree's rifle held ready. For one wild moment, Beth thought it might be Jacob. Then the figure stepped into a patch of sunlight, revealing Thunder Eagle's weathered face. "You live," the Blackfoot said simply. "Good. Others wait beyond the ridge." "Jacob?" Beth couldn't help asking, though she knew the answer. Thunder Eagle's expression revealed nothing. The house fell. Stone was inside. The confirmation struck Beth like a physical blow. Jacob was gone. The man who had sheltered them, protected them, taught them to survive sacrifice so they might escape. "Morgan?" Thomas asked. "Lives," Thunder Eagle replied with obvious distaste. "Left with his men when the fire died. They search the trails now, but not this one. We go north to my people's camp." Beth nodded, pushing her grief aside. There would be time to mourn Jacob later. For now, they needed to focus on survival and on ensuring his sacrifice wasn't in vain. As they followed Thunder Eagle through the forest, Beth clutched the pack containing the evidence more tightly. Jacob had died to protect this, to give them a chance to bring Morgan to justice. She wouldn't waste that chance. Sarah walked beside her, unusually quiet. In her small hand, she clutched the wooden fox Jacob had carved, its surface gleaming in the dappled sunlight. "Mama," she said suddenly, "Mr. Stone knew he might not come out, didn't he? That's why he gave me the fox." Beth looked down at her daughter, wondering how to answer. She settled on the truth. "I think he wanted you to have something to remember him by, yes." Sarah nodded solemnly. "I won't forget, and I'll be brave like he said." "I know you will, little bird." They continued in silence, three survivors of a battle that had claimed too much. Behind them, smoke still rose from what had once been Stone Ridge, a pyre for a man who had lost everything but his honor. And somewhere in the territory, Governor Wallace Morgan rode with his men, believing he had eliminated the last obstacles to his empire. He didn't yet know that his greatest threat had escaped the flames, carrying the evidence that would destroy him. Jacob Stone might be gone, but his war continued, and Beth Reed was now its general. Twilight descended over the Blackfoot camp, painting the circle of lodges in hues of amber and shadow. 3 days had passed since the destruction of Stone Ridge. 3 days of cautious travel through rugged country, avoiding the search parties Morgan had scattered throughout the territory. Thunder Eagle had led them by hidden paths known only to his people, finally bringing them to this secluded valley nestled between twin ridges. Beth sat alone at the edge of the camp, watching the first stars appear above the eastern mountains. Her body ached from the journey, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the hollow weight in her chest. Jacob's absence haunted her, not just the fact of his death, but the manner of it. She had searched the darkness behind her in that tunnel, called his name, and received only silence in return. The not knowing was a wound that refused to heal. Sarah had adapted to their new surroundings with the resilience of childhood, quickly becoming a favorite among the Blackfoot children. Even now, Beth could hear her daughter's laughter mingling with theirs as they played some game involving pebbles and sticks. The wooden fox Jacob had carved remained her constant companion, clutched tightly when she slept and carried carefully during waking hours. Thomas's condition had stabilized under the care of the tribe's medicine woman, though his arm would never regain its full strength. The marshal had spent much of the day in council with Thunder Eagle and the tribal elders, discussing routes to the nearest federal outpost where they might find sympathetic authorities. "Mind if I join you?" Beth looked up to find Thomas standing nearby, his injured arm bound in a sling of woven fibers. "Please," she said, gesturing to the log beside her. Thomas lowered himself carefully, grimacing slightly at the movement. For a moment they sat in companionable silence, watching the darkness deepen over the valley. "Thunder Eagle believes we should head for Fort Benton," Thomas said finally. "There's a federal judge there who isn't in Morgan's pocket. If we can get your evidence to him, he can issue warrants that even Morgan can't ignore." Beth nodded absently. "How soon can we leave?" "That's the problem," Thomas sighed. "Morgan's men have established checkpoints on all the main trails. The alternative routes are—" He hesitated, glancing at her. "Dangerous," Beth finished for him. especially with a child. Yes. Thomas studied her face in the fading light. No one would blame you for staying here, Mrs. Reed. The Blackfoot would protect you and Sarah. Beth shook her head. I can't hide forever, Marshall. And I won't let Jacob's sacrifice be for nothing. At the mention of Jacob's name, Thomas's weathered face softened with genuine regret. He was a good man, better than he believed himself to be. You knew him well. Thomas nodded slowly. We served together in the war. Different units, but same campaigns. Later, when he became marshal, I was his deputy for a time. He paused, seeming to weigh his next words. Jacob wasn't always the man you met. Before Morgan, before the fire that took his family, he was different. How so? Beth asked, hungry for any glimpse of the man she had come to respect, perhaps even care for. Lighter, Thomas said after consideration. Full of purpose, but not consumed by it. He believed in the law and justice. Emma, his wife, she tempered his harder edges. And Ethan, that boy was his world. Beth could picture it Jacob as he might have been surrounded by family, unburdened by the weight of vengeance. The image made his loss all the more poignant. He never told me exactly what happened, she said quietly. Just that Morgan was responsible. Thomas was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant with memory. It was after Jacob had gathered evidence of Morgan's dealings with the railroad bribes, land theft, the massacre of Blackfoot villages. He was preparing to present his findings to the territorial governor. The marshal's voice grew heavier. Morgan sent men to Stone Ridge while Jacob was away. They burned the house with Emma and Ethan inside. Beth closed her eyes, pain washing through her. No wonder Jacob had been so broken, so consumed by hatred. To lose everything in such a brutal manner, it would destroy anyone. When Jacob returned and found them, Thomas continued, something in him changed. He tracked the men responsible, one by one. No trials, no arrests, just justice as he saw it. Vengeance, Beth corrected softly. Yes, Thomas acknowledged. By the time he finished with Morgan's hired guns, his badge was long gone, and his name was mud in every official circle. Morgan spread the story that Jacob had gone mad, murdered his own family in a fit of rage, then fled into the wilderness. Beth's hands tightened into fists, and people believed that Morgan owns the newspapers, the telegraph lines. He controls what people hear. Thomas shook his head wearily. Most folks never knew Jacob Stone as I did. They only knew the myth Morgan created, the dangerous fugitive hiding in the mountains. A log shifted in the nearby fire, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. Beth watched them fade, thinking of Stone Ridge, engulfed in flames, of Jacob trapped in darkness. He saved us, she said quietly. He could have left us to die in that storm, but he didn't. That was the Jacob I knew, Thomas replied. Buried deep, perhaps, but still there. They fell silent again, each lost in their own thoughts. In the distance, an owl called, its mournful sound echoing across the valley. We leave tomorrow, Beth said, finally, decision crystallizing within her. For Fort Benton. Sarah and I will accompany you. Thomas studied her face. It won't be easy. 3 weeks hard travel if we're lucky. I'm not afraid of hard, Beth said simply. Thomas nodded, respect evident in his eyes. Stone chose well when he decided to help you. Before Beth could respond, a commotion arose from the center of the camp, voices raised in alarm, men rushing toward the perimeter. Thomas was on his feet instantly, hand moving to his revolver. Stay here, he ordered, moving quickly toward the disturbance. Beth ignored the command, following close behind. At the edge of the camp, a small group had gathered around a figure slumped on a travois pulled by a weary horse. Thunder Eagle knelt beside the newcomer, speaking urgently in his native tongue. As Beth approached, she caught glimpses of the figure, a white man, clothes torn and bloodied face so bruised and swollen it was barely recognizable. What's happened? She asked a nearby woman. Ryder, the woman replied in halting English. Found on trail, nearly dead. Beth moved closer, medical instincts taking over. The man was in terrible condition, beaten severely with what appeared to be burns on his hands and arms. As Thunder Eagle shifted to allow the medicine woman access, Beth caught sight of a familiar leather vest beneath the blood and dirt. Her heart stopped. Jacob, she whispered, pushing forward. Thunder Eagle looked up, surprise evident in his normally impassive face. You know this man? It's Jacob Stone, Thomas confirmed, kneeling beside the travois. My God, what happened to him? The unconscious man groaned, eyelids fluttering but not opening. Up close, Beth could see the extent of his injuries, systematic, deliberate brutality that spoke of interrogation rather than simple violence. Morgan, she said, the word bitter on her tongue. He didn't die in the fire. Morgan took him. Thunder Eagle nodded grimly. My scouts found him tied to tree, left to die. Morgan's men not far away searching. He escaped, Thomas said, wonder in his voice. Even after this, Beth was already examining Jacob's wounds with practiced hands. We need to get him to shelter. Now. He's lost blood and these burns need immediate attention. At her direction, several Blackfoot warriors carefully lifted Jacob from the travois and carried him to Thunder Eagle's lodge. Inside, by the light of a central fire, Beth worked alongside the medicine woman, cleaning wounds, applying salves, and binding broken ribs. Jacob remained unconscious throughout, his breathing shallow but steady. Will he live? Thomas asked when Beth finally emerged from the lodge hours later, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. If infection doesn't set in, she replied, washing blood from her hands in a basin of heated water. He's strong, but they weren't gentle with him. Thomas's face darkened. Morgan wanted information about the evidence. Did he talk? Thunder Eagle asked, joining them. The question was practical, not accusatory. I don't think so, Beth said. If he had, Morgan's men would be here already. She glanced toward the lodge where Jacob lay. They tortured him for days, then left him to die when he wouldn't break. The knowledge filled her with equal parts horror and fierce pride. Jacob Stone had endured unimaginable suffering rather than betray them. The man she had first thought cold and remote had proven himself with blood and pain. This changes our plans, Thomas said. We can't move him, not in his condition. Beth had been considering the same problem. I'll stay with him, she decided. You take Sarah and the evidence to Fort Benton. Thomas shook his head emphatically. Out of the question. Morgan wants those documents and your testimony. If we split up, he'll hunt you down with everything he has. And if we stay together, we risk losing everything when he finds us, Beth countered. Jacob needs time to heal, time we don't have. Thunder Eagle had been listening silently, his weathered face thoughtful. Now he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of decision. Neither path is good, he said, but there is third way. He looked at Thomas. You go to Fort Benton alone. Take half the evidence, enough to begin. Mrs. Reed and child stay here with Stone, protected by my warriors. In the rest of the evidence, Thomas asked. Hidden, Thunder Eagle replied simply. In place only, I know. If you fail, if Morgan captures you, he still does not win. It was a pragmatic solution, dividing their resources to prevent total defeat. Beth considered it, glancing toward the lodge where Sarah now slept beside Jacob's unconscious form. The girl had refused to leave his side once she learned he was alive, maintaining a solemn vigil with her wooden fox clutched tightly. How soon can you travel? Beth asked Thomas. The marshal flexed his injured arm experimentally. Tomorrow, if necessary. My shooting arm is sound enough. Then it's decided, Beth said. You'll leave at first light. If all goes well, you'll reach Fort Benton in 3 weeks. If we haven't heard from you in a month, you'll know Morgan got to me, Thomas finished grimly, in which case Thunder Eagle will guide you through the mountains to the Idaho Territory. Morgan's influence doesn't extend that far west. The plan settled, they separated to prepare. Beth returned to the lodge where she found Sarah curled beside Jacob's pallet, sound asleep. The girl had placed her wooden fox on Jacob's chest as if the talisman might speed his healing. Beth checked Jacob's bandages, relieved to find no fresh bleeding. In the firelight, with the grime cleaned away, she could see his face more clearly, the strong lines now vulnerable in unconsciousness, the scarred cheek that spoke of earlier battles. His breathing had steadied somewhat, though occasionally a tremor of pain passed through him, even in sleep. She smoothed a damp cloth over his forehead, allowing herself to truly feel for the first time the depth of her relief at finding him alive. Somewhere in the weeks at Stone Ridge, this man had become important to her, not just as a protector or an ally, but as himself. The realization was both frightening and strangely comforting. You're too stubborn to die, Jacob Stone, she whispered, and I'm grateful for it. Dawn arrived with a heavy mist clinging to the valley floor, shrouding the Blackfoot camp in ethereal white. Thomas departed as planned, carrying half of Matthew's evidence and a detailed map provided by Thunder Eagle. Beth watched him ride into the mist with a sense of foreboding. Their fate now rested on the shoulders of a wounded marshal and his ability to evade Morgan's extensive network. Jacob remained unconscious through the day, his body fighting fever and trauma. Beth barely left his side, applying cold compresses to his forehead and forcing sips of broth between his cracked lips when possible. Sarah helped in her own way, telling Jacob stories in a solemn voice, certain that somewhere in his darkness he could hear her. By evening, Beth's fear had grown. Jacob's fever had risen despite her efforts, and his breathing had become labored. The medicine woman brought additional herbs, singing softly as she worked them into poultices for his wounds. "He walks between worlds now," the woman told Beth in halting English. "Must find way back. You call him." Beth didn't fully understand the Blackfoot healing traditions, but she recognized the universal language of critical care. Jacob was failing, slipping away despite their best efforts. When Sarah finally succumbed to sleep, Beth sat alone beside Jacob, watching the firelight play across his fevered face. Outside, the night was alive with the sounds of the camp muted conversations, the occasional life continuing around their small island of struggle. "Jacob," she said softly, taking his hand in hers. It felt hot, dry, the skin rough against her palm. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I need you to fight. Sarah needs you. She hesitated, the words unfamiliar on her tongue. "I need you." No response came. Jacob's breathing continued its labored rhythm. His face remained slack in unconsciousness. Beth tightened her grip on his hand. "You don't get to save us and then leave us," she continued, her voice stronger now. "That's not how this works. You taught Sarah to track, to shoot, to survive. You showed her how to be brave. Now you need to show her how to live." She thought of Stone Ridge, of the life Jacob had built there, isolated, focused entirely on vengeance. It wasn't living, not really. It was existing in a state of suspended grief, allowing hatred to consume everything else. "There's more to life than revenge, Jacob," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Matthew taught me that. Even after everything Morgan took from him, his reputation, his practice, eventually his life, Matthew never stopped believing in justice. Not vengeance, but true justice." Beth reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Jacob's forehead. His skin burned beneath her touch. "When this is over, when Morgan answers for his crimes, what then?" she asked. "Will you disappear back into the wilderness, return to hunting shadows, or will you build something new from the ashes?" Outside, an owl called the same mournful sound from the previous night. Beth listened to it, thinking of all they had lost, all that remained at stake. "I lost everything once," she continued. "When Matthew died, I thought my world had ended. But Sarah needed me, so I found a way forward. One step, then another." She squeezed his hand gently. "You showed me how to be strong again. Now I'm asking you to be strong. For yourself, for us." The last words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning. Beth wasn't entirely ready to examine. She fell silent, listening to Jacob's breathing, willing each ragged inhalation to continue to strengthen. Hours passed. The fire burned low, casting the lodge in dim orange light. Beth's eyes grew heavy, her head nodding with exhaustion. Still, she maintained her vigil, one hand holding Jacob's, the other occasionally checking his pulse at the throat. She was drifting, caught in the hazy space between waking and sleep, when she felt it the slightest pressure against her fingers. Jacob's hand had tightened around hers. Beth's eyes flew open. In the dim light, she could see Jacob's face, still drawn with pain but changed somehow. His eyelids flickered, then opened slightly, revealing a sliver of blue. "Jacob," she whispered, hardly daring to hope. His lips moved, forming words without sound. Beth leaned closer. "Found you," he managed, the words barely audible. Joy surged through Beth, sharp and sweet. "Yes," she said, fighting tears. "Thunder Eagle's men found you. You're safe now." Jacob's eyes closed again, but his grip on her hand remained. "Sarah, she's here, sleeping just there." Beth nodded toward the child's form. "She hasn't left your side." A ghost of a smile touched Jacob's cracked lips, there and gone in an instant. "Stubborn," he whispered. "Like her mother." Beth laughed softly, a relief making her lightheaded. "Rest now," she urged. "We'll talk more when you're stronger." Jacob seemed to drift for a moment, hovering on the edge of consciousness. Then his eyes opened again, finding hers with surprising clarity. "I heard you," he said, each word an effort. "Calling me back." Beth felt heat rise to her cheeks, wondering how much of her one-sided conversation he had absorbed in his fevered state. Then you know you're not allowed to she replied, attempting lightness. Jacob's eyes held hers, serious despite his weakness. Not yet, he agreed. Not until. He didn't finish the thought, exhaustion claiming him once more. His eyes closed, but his breathing had changed deeper, more regular. The fever had broken. Beth released a shuddering breath, tension draining from her shoulders. Jacob would live. The road ahead remained dangerous, uncertain, but they would face it together. She arranged her blanket beside his pallet, unwilling to move far from him even in sleep. As she drifted off, her hand still loosely holding his, Beth allowed herself to imagine a future beyond Morgan, beyond vengeance, a future where wounds might heal and new beginnings might be possible. It was a fragile hope, but tonight it was enough. For 3 days, Jacob drifted in and out of consciousness, each period of wakefulness slightly longer than the last. The fever did not return, and his wounds, while severe, began the slow process of healing. Beth maintained her careful nursing, helped by Sarah and the Blackfoot medicine woman. On the fourth morning, Beth emerged from the lodge to find Thunder Eagle waiting his face grave. "Riders coming," he said with earnest preamble. "From south, many horses." Beth's heart sank. Morgan, Thunder Eagle nodded once. "My scouts count 15 men, heavy weapons." "How did they find us?" Beth asked, though the answer seemed obvious. Morgan's reach was extensive, his resources vast. It had only been a matter of time. "Trail from where Stone was found," Thunder Eagle replied. "They followed back to camp." Beth closed her eyes briefly, thinking rapidly. "How long do we have?" 2 hours, maybe less. Not enough time to evacuate the entire camp, especially with Jacob still too weak to travel far or fast. Beth made a swift decision. "Sarah and I will draw them away," she said. "If they believe we've fled with the evidence, they'll follow us rather than risk attacking the camp." Thunder Eagle's expression didn't change, but disapproval radiated from him. "You will not survive alone." "We won't be alone for long," Beth countered. "Just long enough to lead them away from here. Then your warriors can ambush them in the narrow pass to the west." It was a desperate plan, fraught with risk, but it offered the best chance of protecting both Jacob and the Blackfoot who had sheltered them. Thunder Eagle considered for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I will prepare horses. 6 warriors will follow at distance, ready for ambush." Beth returned to the lodge to gather their meager possessions and explain the situation to Sarah. To her surprise, she found Jacob awake and struggling to sit up. "You shouldn't be moving," she admonished, hurrying to his side. Jacob grimaced but continued his efforts. "Heard talking outside." He managed, his voice weak but determined. "Morgan's coming." "Yes," Beth admitted, seeing no point in hiding the truth. Thunder Eagle's scouts spotted his men approaching from the south. Jacob's face hardened. "Help me up." "You can't possibly think you're in any condition to fight," Beth protested. "You can barely sit up." "Not fighting," Jacob conceded, "but not staying behind either." Beth recognized the futility of argument. Jacob Stone was many things, but tractable was not among them, especially where Morgan was concerned. "Fine," she relented, "but you ride with Sarah. I'll be faster alone, more able to draw them off." Jacob shook his head weakly. "No, together." He caught her wrist with surprising strength. "No more separating." Something in his tone gave Beth pause. Despite his weakened state, there was steel in his voice, the same unwavering determination that had kept him alive through torture and exposure. "All right," she agreed finally. "Together. But you follow my lead for once, Jacob Stone. I didn't nurse you back from death's door just to watch you throw your life away." A ghost of a smile touched Jacob's lips. "Yes, ma'am." Sarah entered the lodge, her small face solemn. "Thunder Eagle says, we have to go, Mama. The bad men are coming." Beth knelt before her daughter. "Yes, little bird, we need to leave very soon. Mr. Stone is coming with us." Sarah's expression brightened. "You're better," she exclaimed, rushing to Jacob's side. "Getting there," Jacob replied, his voice stronger when addressing the child. "Thanks to you and your mama." Sarah beamed, then her face grew serious again. "Thunder Eagle says we're the bait, like when you fish." Beth winced at the blunt assessment. "Something like that. We're going to lead the bad men away from the camp, then Thunder Eagle's warriors will stop them." Sarah nodded, accepting this with the pragmatism of a child who had already seen too much of the world's harshness. "I'll get our things," she said, moving to collect their packs. With help from 2 Blackfoot warriors, Jacob was dressed and helped outside. He was alarmingly weak, barely able to stand without support, but his eyes were clear and determined. 3 horses waited, 2 saddled normally, the third modified with a backrest of sorts. For Stone, Thunder Eagle explained, we'll hold him steady. The thoughtful adaptation brought tears to Beth's eyes. Thank you, she said, clasping the older man's arm in gratitude. For everything. Thunder Eagle inclined his head slightly. You fight for justice. We fight with you. He handed her a small leather pouch. For Stone, medicine for pain. 1 pinch each morning and night. Beth secured the pouch in her dress pocket, then helped Jacob mount the specially prepared horse. He settled into the modified saddle with a barely suppressed groan, his face pale with the effort. East Trail, Thunder Eagle instructed, pointing toward a narrow path leading into the foothills. Follow stream 3 miles, then turn north at Split Rock. My warriors will be watching. Beth nodded, committing the directions to memory. She helped Sarah mount, then swung into her own saddle. Ready, she asked, looking from Sarah to Jacob. Sarah nodded determinedly. Jacob's response was a tight nod, his jaw clenched against pain. Stay alive, Thunder Eagle said simply. We will find you when it is done. With those parting words, they set off, 3 fugitives against the vastness of the Montana wilderness. Behind them, the Blackfoot camp was already being prepared for the coming confrontation, warriors arming themselves, women and children being moved to defensive positions. They followed the stream as instructed, moving at the fastest pace Jacob could manage. Beth rode slightly ahead, constantly scanning for signs of pursuit. Sarah stayed close to Jacob, occasionally steadying him when the terrain grew rough. They had just reached the Split Rock Thunder Eagle had mentioned when the distant sound of gunfire echoed across the valley. Morgan's men had reached the camp sooner than expected. We need to move faster, Beth urged, fighting panic. If they overwhelm the camp quickly. They won't, Jacob interrupted, his breathing labored, but his voice steady. Thunder Eagle knows what he's doing. Beth wasn't convinced, but arguing would only waste precious time. They continued north, leaving the clear trail and cutting across rougher country where their tracks would be harder to follow. By midday, Jacob was swaying in the saddle despite the backrest, his face gray with exhaustion and pain. Beth called a halt in a small grove of pines, helping him dismount and settle against a tree trunk. Rest, she instructed, offering water, just for a few minutes. Jacob drank gratefully, then leaned his head back against the rough bark. Morgan won't stop, he said quietly. Not ever. I know, Beth replied, checking his bandages. Several showed spots of fresh blood where the ride had reopened wounds. We need a plan, Jacob continued, his voice stronger after the brief rest. Beyond running. Beth sat back on her heels, studying his face. Despite his weakened condition, Jacob's mind remained sharp, focused on the threat pursuing them. Thomas is headed for Fort Benton with half the evidence, she explained. If he reaches Judge Harmon, if Jacob emphasized, Morgan has men everywhere. And even if Thomas succeeds, warrants take time. Marshals take time. He shook his head slightly. We need something more immediate. Sarah, who had been gathering pine cones nearby, approached with a handful of wild berries. Thunder Eagle told me these are good to eat, she said, offering them to Jacob. He accepted with a small smile. Thank you, Sarah. The child settled beside him, seemingly comfortable despite the gravity of their situation. Mr. Stone, she said conversationally, are you going to kill the bad governor when you're better? The blunt question hung in the air. Beth started to intervene, but Jacob raised a hand to stop her. No, Sarah, he replied, meeting the child's gaze directly. I'm not going to kill him. I'm going to see him brought to justice. Sarah considered this. Like a trial like Papa wanted. Exactly like your Papa wanted, Jacob confirmed. Killing Morgan would be easy. Making him answer for his crimes, that's harder, but it's right. Beth stared at Jacob, stunned by the transformation in his philosophy. This was not the man consumed by vengeance she had first met at Stone Ridge. Somehow, through all the violence and pain, Jacob Stone had found his way back to the beliefs he had once abandoned. Before she could comment, a sound froze them all, hoofbeats approaching rapidly from the south. They found our trail, Jacob said grimly, struggling to rise. Beth helped him to his feet, fear clawing at her throat. We need to split up, she said urgently. I'll lead them away, you and Sarah. No, Jacob cut her off, his voice suddenly strong despite his weakness. No more sacrifices. We stand together." The hoofbeats grew louder, at least 5 riders approaching fast. There was no time for further debate. "The rocks," Beth decided, pointing to a jumble of boulders 30 yards away. "We can defend that position." Supporting Jacob between them, Beth and Sarah hurried toward the rocky outcropping. They had just reached its shelter when the first rider burst into the clearing, followed closely by 4 others. Beth recognized Sheriff Collins at their head, his face twisted with triumph as he spotted them. "There they are," he shouted. "Get him!" Beth pushed Sarah deeper into the rocks, then drew her revolver. Beside her, Jacob had produced a knife from somewhere, his only weapon but held with deadly intent. As Collins and his men dismounted and spread out to surround the rocks, Beth met Jacob's eyes. In that moment, she saw not defeat or resignation, but a fierce protective resolve that matched her own. They were trapped, outnumbered with a child to protect, and nowhere left to run. But they were together, and they would not surrender easily. "Whatever happens," Jacob said softly, "thank you for bringing me back." Before Beth could respond, Collins's voice rang out. "Stone Reed, come out now, and maybe the governor will be merciful. The girl doesn't have to get hurt." Beth's grip tightened on her revolver. 5 bullets against 5 men. Impossible odds, but she would make every shot count. Jacob shifted slightly, positioning himself to shield Sarah. His eyes never left Beth's face. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Beth nodded, a strange calm settling over her. "Ready." Together they prepared to make their final stand against Morgan's justice. Collins's men advanced cautiously, spreading out to surround the rocky outcropping. Beth counted 5 in total. Collins himself, 2 men she recognized from the attack on Stone Ridge, and 2 strangers whose weathered faces and practiced movements marked them as experienced manhunters. "You've got nowhere to go, Stone," Collins called, his voice echoing off the rocks. "Governor Morgan wants those documents and the woman. Give them up and we'll let the girl live." Jacob shifted painfully, positioning himself more firmly between Sarah and the approaching men. Despite his weakened state, his eyes remained sharp, calculating. 5 of them," he whispered to Beth. "Collins is mine." Beth wanted to argue Jacob could barely stand, let alone fight, but there was no time. She nodded instead, focusing on the 2 men approaching from the left. "Sarah," she said quietly, "remember what Mr. Stone taught you about staying hidden?" The girl nodded solemnly, clutching her wooden fox. "Find the deepest shadow and become part of it." "Good girl. Do that now. Don't come out until one of us calls for you." Sarah hesitated only briefly, then slipped deeper into the crevice between 2 large boulders, making herself nearly invisible in the shadows. Beth positioned herself where she could keep both Sarah and the approaching men in her line of sight. "Last chance, Stone," Collins shouted now, just 20 yards away. "Come out now." Jacob's response was a low, bitter laugh. "You should have brought more men, Collins." The sheriff's face darkened with anger. "Have it your way. Take them," he ordered his men. "The governor wants Stone alive if possible, but don't risk yourselves. The woman and documents are what matter." The men advanced more aggressively now, guns drawn. Beth took careful aim at the nearest, a tall man with a scar crossing his chin, and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the clearing, and the man dropped with a cry, clutching his shoulder. Chaos erupted. Collins and his remaining men dove for cover, returning fire that ricocheted off the rocks around them. Beth pressed herself against the stone, heart pounding, as bullets struck inches from her head. Jacob had flattened himself against a boulder, knife ready but useless at this distance. His face was pale with pain, but his eyes remained focused, searching for an opening. "We can't hold them off for long," Beth said between shots, taking careful aim at a man attempting to circle behind them. Her bullet grazed his leg, sending him scrambling back to cover. "We don't need long," Jacob replied cryptically, his gaze fixed on something beyond the clearing. Before Beth could question him, the sharp crack of a rifle echoed from the forest behind Collins's men. One of the manhunters jerked backward, falling motionless to the ground. "What the—" Collins began spinning toward the new threat. Another shot, other man down. The remaining hired guns began firing wildly into the trees, panic replacing their earlier confidence. "Thunder Eagle," Jacob said with grim satisfaction. "Right on time." Beth realized then what Jacob had known. The Blackfoot warriors had never intended to ambush Morgan's men at the camp. They had used Beth, Jacob, and Sarah as bait, drawing Collins's group into a trap of their own making. From the forest, war cries sounded as Thunder Eagle's warriors emerged firing rifles and brandishing knives. Collins's last remaining man turned to flee and was cut down before he'd taken 3 steps. Collins himself stood alone now, his back to a tree gun swinging wildly between the advancing Blackfoot and the rocks where Beth and Jacob remained. "It's over, Collins," Jacob called, struggling to his feet with Beth's help. "Drop the gun." Collins's face contorted with rage and fear. "This changes nothing. Stone Morgan will hunt you to the ends of the earth. You'll never be safe." "Maybe," Jacob acknowledged, moving painfully forward, "but you won't be there to see it." For a moment it seemed Collins might surrender. Then his expression hardened and he swung his gun toward Jacob. Beth fired without hesitation, her bullet striking Collins squarely in the chest. The sheriff staggered, shock replacing rage on his face. He looked down at the spreading crimson stain, then back at Beth. "You?" he managed before collapsing to his knees, then toppling forward into the dirt. Thunder Eagle approached rifle ready, but Collins was beyond caring. His eyes stared sightlessly at the sky, his gun fallen from lifeless fingers. "You are unharmed?" Thunder Eagle asked, scanning Beth and Jacob for new injuries. "We're all right," Beth confirmed, holstering her revolver. "Sarah is safe." At the sound of her name, Sarah emerged cautiously from her hiding place. When she saw the bodies scattered across the clearing, her small face went very still, but she asked no questions. This was not the first violence she had witnessed, Beth realized with a pang. In the months since Matthew's death, Sarah had been forced to grow up too quickly. Jacob swayed suddenly, his brief surge of strength deserting him. Beth caught him before he could fall, alarmed by the heat radiating from his skin. "He needs rest," she told Thunder Eagle. "The ride and the fight, it's too much too soon." Thunder Eagle nodded, gesturing to his warriors. 2 came forward to support Jacob, who had finally surrendered to exhaustion, his eyes closing as consciousness slipped away. "We may camp here," Thunder Eagle decided. "Not safe to return to village yet. Morgan's main force still searching." As the Blackfoot warriors set about establishing a defensive perimeter and preparing a small smokeless fire, Beth tended to Jacob. His wounds had reopened and fever threatened once more. She worked methodically, cleaning and rebandaging, administering the medicine Thunder Eagle had provided. Sarah watched solemnly, handing Beth supplies as needed. When they had finished, the girl carefully placed her wooden fox beside Jacob's hand. "Will he die?" she asked quietly. Beth brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "No, little bird. He's very strong, and he has too much left to do." Sarah nodded, accepting this with the simple faith of childhood. "He promised to teach me to whittle my own fox when his hands are better." "Then he will," Beth assured her. "Mr. Stone keeps his promises." As twilight descended, Thunder Eagle approached with a small pot of stew. "Eat," he instructed, handing wooden bowls to Beth and Sarah. "Need strength for journey ahead." Beth accepted gratefully, suddenly aware of her own exhaustion. "What happens now?" she asked between mouthfuls of the surprisingly flavorful mixture. Thunder Eagle settled beside them, his weathered face grave in the fading light. "Morgan will know soon that Collins has failed. He will send more men." "We can't keep running," Beth said, voicing the thought that had been growing since their narrow escape. "Even if Thomas reaches Fort Benton with the evidence, Morgan won't stop hunting us." "No," Thunder Eagle agreed. "Men like Morgan do not stop until they are stopped." "Then we stop him," Sarah said suddenly, her small voice firm. "Like Papa wanted to." Both adults turned to the child, startled by her decisive tone. "And how would you do that, little one?" Thunder Eagle asked, a hint of gentle amusement in his voice. Sarah's brow furrowed in thought. "Papa always said the truth is strongest when everyone can see it. We need to show everyone what the bad governor did." Out of the mouths of babes, Beth thought a plan beginning to form in her mind. "She's right," she said slowly. "Morgan's power comes from controlling what people know. What if we change that?" Thunder Eagle's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Hauptoway, the territorial newspaper," Beth explained, excitement building. "The Helena Herald. Matthew said the editor, James Wilson, was one of the few men in the territory not under Morgan's thumb. If we could get the evidence to him, Morgan would move heaven and earth to stop its publication." Thunder Eagle finished. "Exactly." Beth nodded. "Which means he'd have to come himself with whatever forces he has left. It would draw him out away from his strongholds." "A trap," Thunder Eagle said, approval warming his voice. "Using truth as bait." Beth looked down at Jacob's unconscious form. Jacob wanted to destroy Morgan through the law. Matthew wanted to expose his crimes to the world. This way we honor both. Thunder Eagle considered the plan in silence, his expression unreadable. Finally he nodded. It is good, but dangerous. Helena is Morgan's territory. Everywhere is Morgan's territory, until we change that, Beth replied. And Helena is where this started, where Matthew found the evidence where he was killed. There's a rightness to ending it there. When Stone wakes, we will discuss, Thunder Eagle decided. Rest now, I will watch. Beth settled beside Jacob, drawing Sarah close against the night's chill. The child fell asleep quickly, exhausted by the day's events, but Beth remained awake, watching the stars appear above the pines. She thought of Matthew, of his unwavering belief in justice despite the corruption surrounding him. He had died fighting for truth, for the law's protection of the innocent. Now she would finish what he started, not from vengeance, but from the same commitment to justice that had defined his life. Beside her, Jacob stirred, his eyes opening briefly. He seemed disoriented until his gaze found hers. Collins, he asked, voice barely audible. Dead, Beth confirmed. We're safe for now. Jacob nodded, slightly relief passing across his features. Heard, talking. Helena, even half-conscious, he missed nothing. Just an idea, Beth said. Rest now, we'll talk when you're stronger. Jacob's hand found hers in the darkness, his grip weak but deliberate. Good idea, he murmured before drifting off again. Beth held his hand, drawing comfort from the simple contact. Whatever came next, they would face it together, she, Jacob, and Sarah, bound by circumstance, but choosing to remain bound by something deeper. Dawn broke clear and cold over the makeshift camp. Jacob's fever had receded during the night, and he woke clear-headed, though still alarmingly weak. Thunder Eagle's warriors had buried Collins and his men, removing all trace of the confrontation. As Beth helped Jacob sit up and take some broth, Thunder Eagle approached with news. Scout returned, he reported. Morgan pulls men back to Helena. Something happens there. Jacob and Beth exchanged glances. Thomas, Jacob said. He must have reached Fort Benton. Judge Harmon would have telegraphed Helena for supporting evidence. Morgan's consolidating his forces, Beth realized, preparing for legal challenges. Or destroying evidence, Jacob added grimly. Either way, it supports your plan. Helena is where this ends. Thunder Eagle nodded. Journey will be difficult. 3 days hard riding to reach Helena. Stone is not strong enough. I'll manage, Jacob insisted, though his pallor belied his words. We'll take it slowly, Beth decided. 4 days instead of 3. And we'll need disguises. Morgan will have descriptions of all of us circulated throughout the territory. By midday, they were prepared to depart. Thunder Eagle had provided fresh horses and supplies, including clothing that would help them blend in with the settlers and miners who populated the territory. Jacob was dressed as a prospector, his distinctive features obscured by a full beard, his own grown during his captivity, and tinted spectacles. Beth and Sarah were outfitted as a widow and daughter in somber clothing that concealed as much as it revealed. I will send 2 warriors with you, Thunder Eagle said as they prepared to mount. They will guide you on hidden trails. Watch your backs. Thank you, Beth said sincerely, clasping the older man's arm. For everything. Thunder Eagle inclined his head slightly. When Morgan falls, my people's lands may be safe again. This is payment enough. Jacob, already mounted with considerable assistance, extended his hand to the Blackfoot leader. I misjudged you once, he said quietly. It won't happen again. Thunder Eagle accepted the handshake, a rare smile crossing his weathered features. You have remembered who you were, Stone. Before the fire. This is good. The simple observation seemed to affect Jacob deeply. He nodded once, unable to form words around the emotion evident in his eyes. Sarah approached Thunder Eagle last, offering him her wooden fox. This is for you, she said solemnly, to remember us, Bawaang. Thunder Eagle knelt to accept the gift, treating it with the gravity it deserved. I will keep it safe, he promised, and when you return to these mountains, it will be waiting. With final farewells exchanged, they set out, Beth and Sarah on one horse, Jacob on another, flanked by 2 silent Blackfoot warriors who moved like shadows through the forest. Their path took them east, then south, avoiding the main trails where Morgan's remaining men might patrol. The journey was arduous, particularly for Jacob. Though he never complained, Beth could see the toll each day's ride took on his still-healing body. By evening, he was often so exhausted he could barely dismount without assistance, and twice his fever returned, though less severely than before. On the third night, as they camped in a sheltered ravine, just a day's ride from Helena, Beth changed Jacob's bandages by firelight. The wounds were healing, but too slowly, and the constant travel prevented proper rest. "You should have stayed with Thunder Eagle," she admonished gently, applying fresh salve to a particularly nasty burn on his forearm. Jacob shook his head. "My fight," he said simply, "has been for 5 years." Beth secured the bandage, her touch lingering slightly longer than necessary. "And when it's over, what then?" The question hung between them, weighted with possibility. Jacob's eyes met hers, searching. "I've been thinking about that," he admitted, "for the first time in a long time." "And," Beth prompted when he fell silent. Jacob looked toward where Sarah slept peacefully beside the small fire. "There's a ranch in the Idaho Territory, good land far from Morgan's reach. I bought it years ago under another name. A contingency. Somewhere to go if I ever finish this fight." "You planned for after," Beth observed, surprised, "even when you seemed focused only on revenge." Jacob's mouth curved in a slight, self-deprecating smile. "Hope is stubborn, even when you try to kill it." Beth understood then that beneath the hardened exterior, Jacob had always maintained a small, protected space where the future might exist, a future beyond vengeance, beyond pain. "Idaho is supposed to be beautiful," she said carefully, offering neither commitment nor rejection. "Good country for raising horses. And children." Jacob's eyes returned to hers, hope and uncertainty warring in their blue depths. "Beth, a soft whistle from one of their Blackfoot guides interrupted whatever he had been about to say. The warrior materialized from the darkness, his expression urgent. "Riders," he reported tersely, "coming this way. Many." Jacob struggled to his feet, reaching for his rifle. "Morgan." The warrior shook his head. "Army, blue coats, 20, maybe more." Beth and Jacob exchanged startled glances. The army's presence could mean many things, none of them certain to be in their favor. "Could be Morgan called in favors," Jacob suggested grimly. "He has friends in the military." "Or it could be Judge Harmon sent them," Beth countered. "If Thomas reached him with the evidence." There was no time to debate. The sound of approaching horses was already audible, growing louder by the second. "Wake Sarah," Jacob instructed. "Be ready to run if needed." Beth roused her daughter, who came awake instantly alert, as only a child who has learned fear can be. "Soldiers coming," Beth explained quietly. "We don't know if they're friends or enemies." The Blackfoot warriors had already melted into the darkness, unwilling to risk capture by the army. Beth couldn't blame them. Relations between the military and native tribes were tense at best, murderous at worst. Jacob positioned himself between the approach and Beth and Sarah, rifle ready, despite his weakness. They waited in tense silence as the column of riders drew closer, their lanterns visible now through the trees. The soldiers entered the ravine in formation, rifles at the ready. At their head rode a captain distinguished by his insignia and the authority with which he halted the column 30 yards from the small camp. "Jacob Stone," the captain called. "Elizabeth Reed, by order of Judge William Harmon of the United States Circuit Court, I am here to escort you to Helena." Beth felt hope leap within her chest. "Thomas made it," she whispered to Jacob. "He reached Judge Harmon." Jacob lowered his rifle slightly, but remained wary. "Identify yourself," he called back. "Captain James Monroe, 7th Cavalry," the officer replied. "Marshal Thomas arrived in Fort Benton 5 days ago with evidence against Governor Morgan. Judge Harmon has issued federal warrants for Morgan's arrest on charges of corruption, land fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder." Jacob's posture relaxed marginally. "How do we know you are not Morgan's men in stolen uniforms?" The captain gestured and a figure moved forward from the ranks. Thomas himself, arm still bandaged, but sitting straight in the saddle. "Because I wouldn't be caught dead riding with anyone else." The marshal called, a note of triumph in his voice. "It's over, Jacob. We've got him cornered." Only then did Jacob lower his rifle completely. "Thomas," he acknowledged, relief evident in his voice. "You made it through." The marshal dismounted, approaching their camp. "Barely up, he admitted. "Morgan's men dogged me all the way to Fort Benton. But Harmon was waiting as promised. The documents were enough to convince him to act immediately." Captain Monroe joined them, dismounting with military precision. "Judge Harmon has convened a special federal court in Helena," he explained. "Morgan has been officially notified of the charges and ordered to surrender himself tomorrow morning." And will he? Beth asked skeptically. Monroe's expression was grim. Not likely. Our intelligence suggests he's barricaded himself in the governor's mansion with his remaining loyal men. Perhaps 30 in total. A siege, then, Jacob concluded. Potentially, Monroe agreed, which is why we need you both. Your testimony, combined with the physical evidence, will ensure Morgan can't slither out of this legally, and your presence might convince some of his supporters to abandon him before blood is shed. Beth exchanged glances with Jacob. Their plan to expose Morgan through the newspaper had been rendered unnecessary by Thomas's success, but the core goal remained justice, not vengeance. We'll come, Jacob decided, speaking for both of them, but there's something you should know. Morgan tortured me for information after Stone Ridge burned. He wanted the location of additional evidence that directly links him to massacres of Blackfoot villages. Monroe's eyebrows rose. You have this evidence? Thunder Eagle does, Beth explained. He hid it for safekeeping when we split up. Then we need it, Monroe said decisively. Morgan's attorneys will fight tooth and nail to discredit what we already have. Additional evidence could be crucial. One of the Blackfoot warriors had remained close enough to overhear. He stepped forward, now speaking in his native tongue. Jacob listened, then translated. He says he can retrieve the documents and meet us in Helena by noon tomorrow. Thunder Eagle anticipated this need. Monroe nodded, impressed despite himself. Tell him we'd be grateful. As arrangements were made for their journey to Helena, Beth found a quiet moment with Jacob. This isn't how I expected it to end, she admitted. Part of me still can't believe it's almost over. Jacob's expression was thoughtful. It's not over yet. Morgan is cornered, but cornered animals are the most dangerous. We'll be under Army protection, Beth reminded him, and Morgan's power is already crumbling if Judge Harmon has issued federal warrants. True, Jacob acknowledged, but promise me you'll stay vigilant. Keep Sarah close. Always, Beth assured him, touched by his concern. They departed within the hour, Beth and Sarah riding with Thomas, while Jacob, still weak but determined, rode alongside Captain Monroe. The column moved swiftly through the night, taking advantage of the clear weather and bright moonlight. By dawn, they had reached the outskirts of Helena, a bustling territorial capital, nestled in a valley surrounded by towering mountains. Even at this early hour, the town hummed with activity, miners and merchants beginning their day's work. As they rode down the main street toward the territorial courthouse, Beth noticed the tension in the air. Groups of men gathered on corners, watching their procession with undisguised interest. Newspapers had clearly spread word of Morgan's legal troubles. Not everyone's happy to see the governor challenged, Thomas murmured, noting her observation. Morgan's brought prosperity to some, even if it came at others' expense. Prosperity built on stolen land and murdered innocents, Beth replied, keeping her voice low so Sarah wouldn't hear. They reached the courthouse, an imposing stone building with columns flanking its entrance. A contingent of soldiers already stood guard outside, evidence of the federal authority that had descended on Helena. Inside, they were escorted to Judge Harmon's chambers. The judge himself was a tall, austere man with piercing gray eyes and a reputation for incorruptibility. He rose as they entered, offering a formal bow to Beth. Mrs. Reed, he said, his voice deep and measured, your husband was a colleague and friend. I deeply regret that I could not act sooner on his concerns. Thank you, Your Honor, Beth replied. Matthew believed in the law even when it seemed to have abandoned him. He would be grateful for your intervention now. Harmon nodded solemnly, then turned to Jacob. Mr. Stone, your reputation precedes you, though I suspect much of what I've heard has been Morgan's fabrications. Jacob straightened despite his obvious pain. I've done things I'm not proud of, Your Honor, but everything I've done was in pursuit of justice for my family and others Morgan has destroyed. So Marshal Thomas has explained, Harmon acknowledged. Your testimony will be crucial in the coming proceedings. Has Morgan responded to the summons? Thomas asked. Harmon's expression darkened. Not officially, but my sources tell me he's gathering his forces at the governor's mansion. Armed men have been arriving since yesterday. He's preparing for a fight, Jacob concluded. So it would seem, Harmon agreed. Captain Monroe's men have established a perimeter around the mansion, but I've ordered them to avoid provocation. I want Morgan taken alive to stand trial for his crimes. And if he refuses to surrender? Beth asked. Harmon's face was grim. Then the army will do what is necessary. But I pray it doesn't come to that. Too much blood has been shed already. As they discussed the details of the coming confrontation, Beth found herself watching Jacob. Despite his weakened condition, he participated actively in the strategic planning, his knowledge of Morgan's methods proving invaluable. Yet she noticed a fundamental change in his approach. Where once he might have advocated for direct assault, now he supported Judge Harmon's emphasis on peaceful resolution, if possible. The man consumed by vengeance was gone, replaced by one who understood the true meaning of justice. It was Beth reflected exactly what Matthew would have wanted: the law, not the gun, bringing Morgan to account. By mid-morning, word arrived that Morgan had issued a statement denying all charges and refusing to surrender, claiming the federal warrants were politically motivated attacks on territorial sovereignty. Judge Harmon received the news with stoic resignation. "So be it," he said. "We'll proceed with the public reading of charges at noon as scheduled. If Morgan fails to appear, I'll have no choice but to authorize Captain Monroe to execute the arrest warrants by force if necessary." As they prepared to leave the judge's chambers, a commotion arose in the outer office. The door burst open to reveal the Blackfoot warrior who had accompanied them to Helena, his face flushed with exertion. "The documents," he announced, extending a leather pouch. "From Thunder Eagle." Judge Harmon accepted the pouch with appropriate gravity. "Please convey my personal thanks to Thunder Eagle," he said. "These will ensure Morgan cannot escape justice." The warrior nodded, then spoke rapidly to Jacob in his native tongue. Jacob's expression grew increasingly concerned as he listened. "What is it?" Beth asked when the exchange ended. "Morgan's men attacked Thunder Eagle's camp after we left," Jacob translated grimly. "Apparently they tortured one of Collins's survivors until he revealed the location. 2 warriors were killed, but the rest escaped into the high country." Beth's hand went to her mouth. "Morgan's getting desperate." "Desperate men are dangerous men," Harmon observed. "We must be prepared for anything in the coming hours." As noon approached, tension in Helena reached fever pitch. The streets surrounding the courthouse filled with citizens, miners, settlers, and journalists, all drawn by rumors of the governor's impending downfall. The army maintained a tight cordon around the building, allowing only official participants to enter. Beth, Jacob, Thomas, and Sarah were escorted to seats near the front of the courtroom. The chamber itself was packed to capacity, with standing room only along the walls. At precisely 12 o'clock, Judge Harmon entered his black robes, lending additional gravity to his already imposing presence. "This special session of the United States Circuit Court for the Montana Territory is now in session," the bailiff announced. Harmon surveyed the crowded room, his expression solemn. "We are gathered today to address serious allegations against Governor Wallace Morgan," he began. "The charges include corruption, land fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and violations of federal treaties with sovereign Indian nations." A murmur ran through the assembly. Harmon continued detailing the evidence assembled against Morgan: Matthew's legal documents, Jacob's testimony regarding the Blackfoot massacres, Thomas's sworn statements, and Thunder Eagle's records. "In light of these charges and the substantial evidence supporting them," Harmon concluded, "I have issued federal warrants for Governor Morgan's immediate arrest. He was summoned to appear before this court at noon today to answer these charges." The judge paused, surveying the room. "Is Governor Morgan or his legal representative present?" Silence greeted the question. Harmon waited a full minute, then spoke again. "Let the record show that Governor Morgan has failed to appear as summoned. In his absence, I hereby order Captain James Monroe of the 7th Cavalry to execute the arrest warrants forthwith." As Captain Monroe rose to acknowledge the order, the courtroom doors burst open. A hush fell over the assembly as Wallace Morgan himself strode in, flanked by 4 armed men. The governor wore a tailored suit and an expression of cold fury, his silver beard neatly trimmed, his bearing that of a man accustomed to commanding respect. "There's no need for warrants, Judge Harmon," Morgan announced, his cultured voice carrying to every corner of the room. "I am here to address these slanderous accusations personally." Beth felt Sarah press against her side, small fingers clutching her dress. Jacob tensed beside them, his hand moving instinctively toward the gun he'd been required to surrender before entering the courthouse. Judge Harmon remained impassive. "Governor Morgan, you stand accused of serious federal crimes. Your armed escort is not welcome in this courtroom. They will surrender their weapons immediately or be removed." Morgan smiled thinly. "My men are simply ensuring my safety given the hostile environment you've created, Judge. But as a gesture of good faith, they will wait outside." With a nod from Morgan, his four guards withdrew, closing the doors behind them. The governor approached the bench alone, his confidence undiminished. "Now, Kamahe," he said, "I'm prepared to address these baseless allegations and expose them for the political conspiracy they truly are." "You will have your opportunity to speak, Governor," Harmon replied evenly. "But first you will hear the charges against you and the evidence that supports them." For the next hour, the court proceedings unfolded with methodical precision. Judge Harmon presented the case against Morgan. Piece by piece, land deeds fraudulently obtained, federal officials bribed, Blackfoot treaties violated, and finally the murders of Matthew Reed and Jacob's family. Throughout, Morgan maintained a facade of indignant disbelief, occasionally shaking his head or scoffing quietly. But Beth, watching closely, noted the growing tension in his shoulders, the tightening of his jaw, as each new piece of evidence was presented. When Judge Harmon revealed Thunder Eagle's documents, detailed maps showing the locations of Blackfoot massacres ordered by Morgan, complete with dates and names of military units involved, the governor's composure finally cracked. "This is absurd," he exploded, rising to his feet. "These are obvious forgeries created by savages and their sympathizers. I demand this farce be ended immediately." "You are not in a position to make demands, Governor," Harmon replied coldly. "The evidence against you is substantial and compelling. I am prepared to rule on the validity of the arrest warrants and bound you over for trial." Morgan's face flushed with rage. "You have no authority here. This territory is under my jurisdiction, not yours." "Federal law supersedes territorial authority, as you well know," Harmon countered. "Now, will you submit to arrest peacefully, or must Captain Monroe employ force?" For a moment, it seemed Morgan might actually surrender. His gaze swept the courtroom, lingering briefly on Beth and Jacob. Something shifted in his expression, calculation replacing outrage. "Very well," he said, his voice suddenly calm. "I will cooperate under protest, but I request a moment to inform my staff of the situation. They're awaiting word outside." Judge Harmon hesitated, then nodded. "Captain Monroe will accompany you." "That won't be necessary," Morgan replied smoothly. "I give you my word as a gentleman that I will return promptly." "Your word is insufficient, Governor," Harmon said firmly. "Captain." Monroe approached, his hand resting on his sidearm. "This way, sir." Morgan's eyes narrowed, but he followed the captain toward the courtroom doors. As they opened, a sudden commotion erupted in the hallway beyond, shouting, then gunshots. Captain Monroe instinctively turned toward the disturbance. In that moment of distraction, Morgan moved with surprising speed for a man his age. From within his coat, he produced a small Derringer pistol previously concealed from the cursory inspection at the door. "This ends now," he shouted, swinging the weapon toward the bench where Judge Harmon sat. Jacob reacted instantly, lunging from his seat despite his injuries and tackling Morgan from behind. The Derringer discharged its bullet, embedding harmlessly in the wooden ceiling as both men crashed to the floor. Chaos engulfed the courtroom. Spectators screamed and dove for cover as more gunshots sounded from the hallway. Captain Monroe drew his weapon, shouting orders to his men. Beth pulled Sarah beneath a bench, shielding the child with her body while trying to keep sight of Jacob. He and Morgan were struggling on the floor, the governor displaying unexpected strength as he fought to bring the Derringer to bear once more. "Jacob!" Beth called in warning as Morgan nearly succeeded in aiming the weapon. With a supreme effort, Jacob pinned Morgan's gun hand to the floor, smashing it against the hardwood until the Derringer clattered free. The governor's face contorted with hatred as he found himself overpowered. "You should have died in that firestone," he spat. "Just like your whining brat and his mother." Something dangerous flashed in Jacob's eyes, a momentary glimpse of the vengeful man he had once been. His hand closed around Morgan's throat, tightening slowly. "Jacob, no," Beth called, recognizing the precipice on which he stood. "Not like this." Jacob froze his gaze, finding hers across the chaotic courtroom. In that suspended moment, a choice hung between them: justice or vengeance, law or personal retribution. Slowly, deliberately, Jacob released his grip on Morgan's throat. "You'll hang by the law, Morgan," he said, his voice steady. "Not by my hand." Federal marshals swarmed forward, securing Morgan and hauling him to his feet. Outside, the gunfire had ceased, replaced by shouted orders as the army regained control. Thomas appeared at the courtroom doors, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead, but otherwise unharmed. "Morgan's men tried to force their way in," he reported. "We've contained them. The governor's mansion has surrendered." A ragged cheer went up from the spectators who had remained. Judge Harmon, who had taken cover behind the bench, emerged to restore order. "Remove the prisoner to secure holding," he instructed the marshals. "Captain Monroe, secure the building and prepare for immediate transfer of the governor to federal custody in Denver." As Morgan was led away, he passed close to where Beth now stood with Sarah. The governor's eyes, cold with defeat, met Beth's for a brief moment. "Your husband was a fool," he said quietly, "and you'll never be safe. Not as long as I have friends with long memories." Beth drew herself up, meeting his gaze unflinchingly. "My husband was a hero," she replied, "and you're nothing but a common criminal now. History will remember which was which." Morgan's face twisted with impotent rage as the marshals hustled him away. Beth turned to find Jacob leaning heavily against a nearby pillar, his face pale with exhaustion, but his eyes clear and present. "It's over," she said, moving to support him. "Truly over." Jacob nodded slowly, his gaze following Morgan's retreating figure. "Not quite," he replied. "There's still the trial, testimonies, appeals." "But he'll never walk free again," Beth insisted. "Never threaten another family or steal another acre." "No," Jacob agreed, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "He won't." Sarah approached cautiously, her small hand finding Jacob's. "Did you get the bad man, Mr. Stone?" Jacob looked down at the child, then back to Beth. Something in his expression softened the last hard edges of the man he had been giving way to something new, something that looked remarkably like peace. "We got him, Sarah," he said, squeezing her hand gently. "All of us together." As the courthouse gradually emptied, Judge Harmon approached their small group. "You've done this territory a great service," he said solemnly. "All of you. Once Morgan faces trial in Denver, his network will crumble. The land he stole can be returned to rightful owners, including the Blackfoot." "And Stone Ridge?" Jacob asked. "My property." "Legally still yours," Harmon confirmed, "though I understand there's not much left of it." Jacob nodded, his expression thoughtful rather than regretful. "Some things can't be rebuilt," he said, "and some shouldn't be." Beth understood his meaning. Stone Ridge had been a fortress, a monument to vengeance and isolation. Whatever Jacob built next would serve a different purpose. "What will you do now?" Harmon asked, looking between them. Jacob's eyes met Beth's, a question in their blue depths. "That depends," he said quietly. Beth felt the weight of the moment, the culmination of months of running, fighting, and finally justice. Matthew was gone, but his work had been completed. Morgan would face punishment for his crimes. The future, for the first time since her husband's murder, stretched before her, unmarked by fear. "I hear Idaho is beautiful country," she said, holding Jacob's gaze. "Good place to raise horses. And children." The hope that bloomed in Jacob's face was answer enough. Sarah, watching them both with solemn understanding, smiled for the first time since the courthouse chaos had erupted. Outside, the spring sun shone on Helena's dusty streets. Citizens gathered in small groups discussing the dramatic events they had witnessed. The territorial capital would never be the same. The corrupt power structure that had dominated it for years had been irrevocably broken. As Beth, Jacob, and Sarah emerged from the courthouse, Thomas joined them, his head now bandaged, but his spirit undimmed. "What now?" he asked. "Denver for the trial." "Eventually," Jacob agreed, "but first I think we all need some healing time." Thomas nodded, understanding. "The Idaho property." "You knew about that?" Jacob asked, surprised. Thomas smiled slightly. "I know you, Jacob Stone. You always have a contingency plan." He looked at Beth and Sarah, then back to his old friend. "Though I suspect your plans might have expanded somewhat recently." Jacob's hand found Beth's tentative but steady. "Some changes are worth making," he said quietly. As they walked toward the hotel where rooms had been arranged for them, Beth reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From that snowy night when she had first knocked on Jacob's door, desperate and afraid, to this spring day of triumph and new beginnings, it had been a path marked by hardship, sacrifice, and unexpected grace. They had come seeking shelter and found justice. They had come as strangers and found family. They had come broken and found healing, not complete perhaps, but begun. The West was changing, the wild edges giving way to law and civilization. But some things remained constant: the importance of truth, the strength found in standing together, the healing power of justice rightly served. And as the sun set over the mountains that rimmed Helena's valley, painting the sky in hues of amber and gold, Beth thought that perhaps the most important constants were the simplest land beneath your feet, honor in your heart, and family by your side. Some homes, after all, weren't made of wood and stone. They were made of promises kept, battles fought together, and love that survived the fire. End of part 5, conclusion of story.